One here. All right. Sorry, I just got a oh, there we go. Just got a toolbar that threw me off a little bit there. All right. So, yes. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but I do think that there's some trouble, I would say, and this is something I really headbutted over, of the way that history departments are set up in a very period specific sort of way, so that doing this Western esotericism thing is not particularly conducive, at least when I was applying, which was actually a little while ago. And I think that's actually kind of unfortunate. So taking kind of these longer views like I ended up doing, I actually ended up going over to religious studies, kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to do that. Because I was kind of told, no, you don't just go out and pick some big field you want to study. Things are quite kind of set. You take these classes and then you think about your research, and you will have a particular field to move into. And I suppose that's actually good if you want to get a job, because then it gets kind of how it operates. But I do think that is a real reason why Mormonism, I think, has kind of suffered to fit into larger contexts. Now, I did, research wise, not necessarily job wise, I was fitted to be able to work under my advisor, who thought this was all cool and kind of let me do what I wanted. So I did end up being able to take some of that bigger context. And we'll be talking about that today. So this title, again, it is a little bit clickbait. Where was Zarahemla? And I will sort of address where I view Joe Smith thinking of it. But let's go ahead and get started. Just give you a little context. In fact, let me just go shut my door real quick. This thing going on. All right, so here we are. Joe Smith in the Ancient Religion, or Where Was Zarahemla? All right, so this is something Trevor had mentioned. I've finished my dissertation 9 years ago and have been revising it ever since. It turned out to be a very large project of what I'm thinking of as an intellectual biography of Joseph Smith. In other words, where does Joseph Smith get his ideas? And I'm arguing there's two main sources, Jane Lead and Plato. I'm not really talking about Jane Lead today. I've given a number of papers on her. I'm going to talk more about Plato, though. And basically what I am in this is I'm arguing for what I would think of as an informed Joseph Smith, that he has access to the ideas that he then shares as Mormonism. And they fit within, again, what we think of in this group of Western esotericism. And that Mormonism is a product of study and faith, like his revelations commanded. And that he goes through this process too, and I'll be talking about that. Then I also think of a larger project. This tracing Joe Smith ideas, I know traditionally would be kind of framed as a skeptical, non-believing approach. A practicing Mormon, I just was released as a bishop, and I feel that understanding this esoteric stuff is kind of an important part of my own religiosity. And just to kind of get out of the way, as I talk about this and things in the Book of Mormon, I don't personally see it as historical, and I'm going to be framing it that way, as not historical as I proceed. And one of the things that I think about, even in this kind of scholarship, is thinking about believing in Mormonism without that historical Book of Mormon, and an informed Joseph Smith. Again, how I present it is that he had access to the ideas that he shared. I still see Mormonism as quite a remarkable and good thing. It's something that I like. Again, I'm not debating that's not what this is about. But this is an academic presentation, but I'm thinking about kind of those larger issues also. So just kind of give you the thesis of this presentation. I'm arguing that sources in Joseph Smith's environment and family religiosity things like grimoires, in other words, magic books, or universalism, which was a family religion, would have pointed to Plato as an important source of suppressed religious truth. And I'll go over that in a bit. And then there were available reference works like Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History, which Joe Smith owned, and Enfield's History of Philosophy, which was for sale in Palmyra, which discussed the idea, which was called then most often it was referred to as the ancient theology, but sometimes the ancient religion. And I'll get into more specific definitions, but it was the idea of these doctrines that were found among, great ancient sages in the ancient world, but that it was essentially the ideas of Plato. Okay, he was the one who was taught most clearly. So the idea is essentially Platonism, but the idea is that it's Plato himself had drawn on this long tradition. Okay, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And my argument, this is actually a pretty central argument in my book as well, is that Smith became convinced that this ancient religion was missing from the Bible and that he needed to restore its doctrines, and that he thought of this religiosity they needed to restore as the fullness of the gospel. And that also related to that is that he seemed to believe that there was a, Book of Mormon, there was this lost ancient American civilization that also had these ideas, and I'll be going through the sources that would have suggested that concept as well. So that's what I mean by where's Zarahemla. So most of this is going to be, again, on this concept of the ancient religion, and then getting into the scholarship on ancient Americans, right? Because there's some connections there as well. So first and foremost, as the Book of Mormon states, the Bible is missing truth, right? The great and abominable church have taken away from the gospel many parts which are plain and precious, right? So from the get-go, it says the Bible is missing things. And my argument is that this is pretty essential to understanding Joseph Smith and Mormonism and what he's trying to do. I do think that we sometimes get mistaken in thinking that it's all about restoring biblical practice, and in some ways, yes. But I do think that we sometimes miss this fact that I think is really important, is that he also wanted, in fact, I would say even more so, restore what it was the Bible was missing, right? So what is the Bible missing? And to even go further, there's this really interesting statement. We now have it in our heading of DNC 76, but it's a heading that Joseph Smith had put into the introduction in his 1838 history for DNC 76. And what it says is that from Sunday revelations, which had been received, it was apparent that many important points touching the salvation of men have been taken from the Bible, right? So again, that's something that it would repeat what we see in the Book of Mormon. Some things have been taken out, but then it goes even further. Or were lost before it was compiled. There was also not the sense of, again, the Bible having all the truth, but here he goes further to say that maybe the Bible never ever did, right? Were lost before it was even compiled. Again, statement that he had made. All right, so big question. So what was it that he thought was missing? Well, my argument would be Mormon doctrine, right? Particularly this idea of the fullness of the gospel. Now, as we know, the Book of Mormon doesn't have a whole lot of things that Joe Smith taught later, or at least not explicitly, right? What we think of the Nauvoo doctrine, right? And I also think that the Book of Mormon actually says so, right? In 1 Nephi 13:34, I will be merciful to the Gentiles in that day, insomuch that I'll bring forth unto them much of my gospel, right? So he's talking about how the plain and precious truth will be restored when the Gentiles get the Book of Mormon, but it will be not the whole gospel, it will be much of the gospel, which shall be plain and precious, right? He will restore this plain and precious truth, which the Book of Mormon will have, saith the Lamb, right? So if you go through it, the Book of Mormon actually does not say that it contains this other thing called the fullness of the gospel, right? So here it says as much. We do get the statement from Moroni and Joseph Smith's 1838 history saying it did contain the fullness, but it's not what the Book of Mormon itself says, right? So that we have kind of two levels of kinds of truth of the book that the Bible seemed to be missing. One was the plain and precious truths that the Book of Mormon had and would be restored when it was given to the world. But there was an additional set of truth, the fullness, right? So these two categories, the plainness and the fullness. And I do believe that the Book of Mormon hits at some of the fullness, right? Again, more things in line with the Nauvoo doctrine, or not just Nauvoo, but things that are revealed later by Joseph Smith. And that is kind of what he had his mind to restore. So what's the fullness of the gospel? Now, in my opinion, having looked at this a real long time, he's breaking down these essential doctrines that, again, he's going to start revealing shortly after the Book of Mormon and continue to the end of his life, right? And the key aspects of it, I would argue, are would probably fit around notions of the plan of salvation. Not that's all it is, but mostly the plan of salvation, right? So the idea of preexistence and this plan, right, that we all learn, if you're Mormon, right, learn in Sunday school your whole life. You're sent to earth to be tested. You need to live the right way. You need to undergo the proper rituals, the proper ordinances, right? A big part of what you need to undergo is holy marriage. And if you do that right, it will be eternal, right? So we'll have this eternal marriage if you do it properly, right? And it all points to, this very fundamental Mormon idea of deification. Part of holy living, at least in the ideal, is some sort of utopian, where you share goods, and marriages are also involved in that. And then this idea of a somewhat, more complex afterlife than a simple heaven and hell. He adopts what we would think of as near universalism, that only very few would suffer forever, and that there were multiple afterlife states. So my argument is that these are the elements. This is what the fullness of the gospel is. This is what he needs to restore. And what's significant about this is that every single one of those items you can find in Plato, okay? That is all in Plato. Every single one is explicitly taught by Plato. So I find that interesting. Even DNC 76, the heavenly structure described there, is very similar to Plato's Phaedo. Now, you probably want me to show that, but I'm not going to get off on that because I want to make a bigger point. But it is, trust me. And a number of the key aspects of the fullness are actually hinted at in the Book of Mormon, bringing me to the conclusion that Joseph Smith didn't know the fullness when he produces the Book of Mormon, but felt that the time was not right. He wanted to lay kind of a foundation first and then reveal the fullness later when people are more ready, which is actually the definition of esotericism. You only reveal the higher truth to those who are ready, right? And so he wants to be cautious not to reveal this higher truth except to those who are properly prepared. So that the Book of Mormon does hint at some of these key doctrines. So for instance, deification, right? Christ tells the three Nephites, ye shall be even as I, Christ, am, and I am even as the Father. This is 3 Nephi 28:10. So if the three Nephites can be like Christ, and Christ is like the Father, then, if you just do your basic math, the three Nephites will become as the Father, which suggests deification, okay? Deification is a very important doctrine in Plato. In the Republic, it says that when the guardians of the city die, the city will publicly erect for them monuments as to superior beings and divine men, right? And then one of my favorite lines in the Phaedrus, these are translations from the available translations of Plato that were available in Joseph Smith's day, okay? So one of my favorite lines from the Phaedrus is that if you live philosophically, by an application to which even God becomes divine. So if you go through this proper process, even God can become divine, which even suggests a little bit like King Follett, a little bit, God himself becoming divine. The most fundamental Platonic doctrine, and this doesn't properly get taught, in my opinion, in universities, but the most fundamental doctrine is preexistence. That we lived in a higher state before we came here. Coming here is kind of a fall, and what we're trying to return. That's what Plato says over and over and over again, and I don't know why we don't stress that as much as we should when universities teach this, right? And it's talked about in lots and lots of his dialogues, but what's particularly interesting is that two of his dialogues lay out kind of a larger program. You might even call it kind of a plan, right? Of how this all works, how we leave the pre-existent state and come to Earth. So much so that parts of the Timaeus, which Plato's Timaeus, which lays this out, is quite similar to Abraham 3, where we get our own descriptions of many aspects of the plan of salvation. I'm not going to go into that also because that's in my dissertation. So take a look at that if you want. The Phaedrus also talks about this, right? in which he talks about there's different types of souls, and they come to earth and become different kinds of people, and depending on how much truth you viewed in the pre-existence would determine what kind of person you are on earth, right? You know, the more truth you saw, the better kind of person you would be on this earth, right? And Alma 13, right, where it talks about the hints of pre-existence, those that were in the first state, and who it will be, who will be able to join the order of Melchizedek, right? Depending on the right choices that they made in the pre-existence, right? So again, these are Platonic doctrines, and we do get some hints in the Book of Mormon. Now, eternal marriage. This is a also taught by Plato. Okay, is mentioned in two of his dialogues, the Symposium and the Phaedrus, right? In the Symposium, Aristophanes, who's speaking in the dialogue, gives a myth or a story of how it is. He's trying to explain love, and he says what we used to be kind of these joined hermaphrodites, but then we were too powerful that God split us in half, and we became this male and female pair. And so what we're looking for is literally, this is where the old notion of other half comes from, looking for other half because we want to be joined back together. And if the god Hephaestus showed up and said, you know, and so when we do, we're so happy, we just want to, like, you know, just love and hug each other constantly. And then if what we truly want is to be welded together once again, so that we can become one, and that the ultimate ideal is that when we die, right, there will be in the state of souls departed, continuing still undivided. What we really want is to be one in the next life, and that's in Aristophanes' myth in the Symposium. The Phaedrus, which also has kind of this plan of salvation a little bit, also talks about the importance of love, and that it's through love that one of the ways that we become more like God is through love, and that we prepare ourselves to return to God, and that but you have to do it in the right way, right? Good philosophical love, which is full of you know, self-restraint, and so but those who do so, when they die and begin their celestial progressions, they will be happy with each other during their progressions, right? So those who love properly will be together in the next life. Okay. Plato also talks about that in the Republic, the ideal state is that all goods are in common, which also means all marriages and families, which means everyone's married to each other, right? You know, radical ideas, and this is something that gets mentioned in some of his other dialogues as well. Now, I don't want to get off on this too much, but I've argued in my dissertation everywhere in other places that what I argue is that before Joseph Smith gets a ton of blowback in 1842, the summer of 1842, when John C. Bennett kind of blows up and Orson Pratt blows up, the original plan was that both men and women would be able to have multiple spouses, and that we see some hints of this. For instance, John C. Bennett reports that when Smith proposed to Nancy Rigdon, he told her that marrying him would not prevent her from marrying another person. Okay. I argue this is the reason why most of Joseph Smith's wives were married before 1843, right? And we also get a hint at this in D&C 132, verse 41, where it says, you have asked concerning adultery. It says, if she be with another man, and I have not appointed unto her by the holy anointing, then it's adultery, which suggests that if a woman could have more than one husband, if appointed by the holy anointing, right? So that's verse 41, right? There is this caveat, and I have not appointed unto her by the holy anointing. And I argue that this is actually hinted at in the Book of Mormon as well. In Jacob 2, right? We famously know there's the big condemnation of polygyny, right? Man having lots of wives, but then throws in this caveat, for if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things. There is this option of allowing for more marriages. Now, that phrase, raise up seed, is used in the Old Testament when the brother is to marry his dead wife's spouse and raise up seed to his brother. But this is different. This is raise up seed unto God, not unto the brother. And what's interesting is that phrase, raise up seed to the brother, is used when the Sadducees ask Jesus about eternal marriage, right? They say, hey, well, what if this happens 7 times and a woman marries all 7 of these brothers? right? In the resurrection, therefore, when they rise, whose wife shall she be of them? For the 7 had her to wife, right? And of course, we know Jesus says, there in the resurrection, there is no marriage. They're not married or given in marriage, right? So those who believed in eternal marriage, right, something that Plato teaches, and Mormonism teaches as well, you have to kind of deal with that, right? You have to deal with, okay, well, the New Testament seems to say not, right? Because it says they are neither married nor given in marriage. And so D&C 132, which does talk about eternal marriage, addresses that. And it says, okay, but the problem is you just need to do it by the proper priesthood. If you do it by the proper priesthood, then the marriage will continue, right? It kind of adds this explanation. So again, Plato does have eternal marriage. And so if you combined these two Platonic marital themes, right, you have eternal marriage, you can be married in the next life. Then the ideal marriage on earth, the most utopian form, is that the most philosophical people will all be married to each other. Well, that could suggest that it was actually okay for a woman, right, to have these multiple marriages in the next life, right? Therefore, I do think that Joseph Smith, on these points, pre-existence, deification, and shared eternal marriage, was actually hinting at these concepts in the Book of Mormon. They are rather vague. They are rather what we, again, the theme of this thing, they're rather esoteric, right? You have to understand the higher truth to be able to see what was going on. All right. Now, it explicitly says over and over that the Nephites had more truth that they were not sharing, especially when Jesus comes, right? So Jesus comes and says he teaches such wonderful things, they can't write it down. And then Mormon adds, but behold, the place of Nephi do contain the more part of the things which Jesus taught the people, right? And these things have I written, which are a lesser part, right? We're not going to write everything down, right? Jesus taught this full of truth. We don't write it down. And then verse 9, and when they shall have received this, which is expedient that they shall have first, in other words, the Gentiles who will get the Book of Mormon, to try their faith. And if it so be that they shall believe these things, then shall greater things be made manifest unto them, right? We'll give you more if you believe the plainness of the gospel, right? The more simplest truths in the Book of Mormon, then you will receive more, which again, I believe is what he thought of as the fullness of the gospel, right? And then he finally says, I was about to write them down, but God said, no, don't write it down, right? So the Nephites, particularly from Jesus, had more truth that they do not write in the Book of Mormon, okay? Now in 1 Nephi 13, it says that when Christ visits the Nephites, they shall write many things which I shall minister unto them, and that he will be restoring truth, Christ tells Nephi in 1 Nephi 13, that is not in the Bible, okay? So this will be restored, and again, it's not all the truth as much, right? And when Nephi is talking about this in 2 Nephi 32, he talks about Christ's visit, and he said he was going to write more. He's writing about the gospel, and he says he cannot write more. The Spirit stoppeth mine utterance, which would also suggest that Nephi knew about the greater truth that Christ was going to bring as well. All of this points to a point I want to make. Sorry if this is taking a little long, is that the argument is, just a second, the Nephites had this fuller truth, or at least some of them did, right? There was this fuller truth, this fullness, right? This fullness that you find in Plato. It's arguing, and again, my argument would be this higher truth is probably the fullness, right? Probably not something totally obscure. It's probably this additional truth that Joseph Smith is planning to teach. That's my sense of it. And that the Nephites have it, right? That they have this additional truth, what we would think of as the fullness, but again, it's only hinted at in the Book of Mormon. It's not fully written down, okay? Again, this is what esotericism is, right? You reserve the higher truth for those who are spiritually ready. Esotericism means teachings that are within the walls, if I understand. I don't know if that's Greek or Latin, but it's one of those two. And this is quite common in the classical world, okay? This idea of it seems very contrary to how we like things nowadays. That's like seen as quite offensive to most modern sensibilities, but that was really common in the ancient and classical world. And Jesus flat out lays out the whole concept with the parable of the sower in Mark. Unto you is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but unto them that were without, again, it was that's esoteric versus exoteric, in the walls, outside the walls. Those who are without, all things are done in parables. I'm going to speak in this obscure way because it's only for those who are within sight. And Plato does this a lot too, right? He says explicitly, I'm not going to write down the things that are the highest truth I won't write down, Plato says. Again, this is a very common idea in antiquity. All right, so this all leads me to a funny question that was on my mind, having been working on this for a long time, right? Why did Joseph Smith believe or propose that there was a lost American ancient civilization that had the fullness of the gospel? And again, the fullness of the gospel is in line with this idea of ancient religion. And again, the ancient religion is Platonism. So why is it that he thought that? Why is he thought that there were these ancient Americans who had this fullness, ancient religion, Platonic doctrine? Again, that might sound like a funny question, but it was sort of on my mind, and I will propose an answer to that question, okay? But let's keep going. Let me first kind of explain what all these concepts mean, okay? So part 2, you're probably getting a whole lot of people who are wondering this, and that is the whole wonderment of why the heck would Joseph Smith read Plato, right? There is the assumption that that is ivory tower stuff that country bumpkins would leave alone. Well, not if you're an esotericist. So let me explain, okay? All right, why read Plato? So for instance, we know that being involved in treasure digging, and this has been pointed out quite clearly by Michael Quinn's Magic Worldview book, you're going to be relying on grimoires and other good works on treasure digging say this as well, though the books are really, really important. Well, these magic books refer to Plato all the time, okay? Because Plato, particularly the Neoplatonists who come after him, are seen as being experts on different kinds of spirits. And being able to communicate with spirits is seen as like a key component of treasure digging, right? Because there's usually a treasure guardian, and you usually need to be able to negotiate with these spirits if you're going to get the treasure. And so Plato often gets referred to. So he would have been running into these references to Plato in these grimoires. Okay, most of them make references to them, right? The second point, there is a lot of talk about Joseph Smith's lack of education. And I'm certainly not saying that he's some sort of college grad, right? But oftentimes people will leave out this line that I think is really important. And again, this is backed up by a number of sources. The education that Joseph Smith gets when he's 20 down in South Bainbridge, right? So when he's called up on trial for the first time and they ask him the question, well, what do you spend most of your time doing? Right? Because he's put on trial for doing the treasure digging. Josiah Stoll's nephews are really unhappy and saying that just Smith is defrauding him. And they ask him, what do you spend most of your time doing? And he says, he's employed by Stoll on his farm and going to school. Okay. And again, this is verified. We have other sources saying that, yes, he was going to school down when he was in 1826 down in South Bainbridge. Right. One of the things that the grammar of the line could suggest is that Stoll employed Smith both to work on the farm and to go to school. Now, I don't know if that's literally what the scribe was trying to say, but I would say this, right? A couple of things. One, most people would be done with the kind of education they had back in the day was usually done around 16. Smith was 20, so he isn't just going through the motions to be getting this education, right? This is above and beyond to get more education, okay? And one of the reasons why there is reason to believe that this would actually have been promoted by Stoll is the point I had made before, right? The grimoires. You wanted, and there's been really good research on this, on treasure digging, you wanted, at this time of this day and age, you wanted a very educated treasure digger, right? The better the educated the guy was, that was seen as more successful. And you would be studying all these grimoires and all this esoteric knowledge, right? So he absolutely wanted that. So it is actually likely that Stoll would have employed Smith to become more learned in these topics. And again, the grimoires point to Plato. They talk about Plato. Reading Plato probably could have fit under the rubric of that Stoll would have been willing to employ. Because again, the grimoires say that the Platonists are the ones with the best knowledge of spirits, okay? Now, there's another thing going on that also would have pointed Joseph Smith to Plato, and that is universalism, okay? This is a big part of the family religion. His father and grandfather were both this, okay? The Knights that he became good friends with while right at this time, 1826, South Bainbridge, they were also Universalists. That's what it says at the bottom right. It says Knights were Universalists, but were willing to reason upon me with my religious views. He and I had many serious conversations on the important subject of man's eternal salvation, right? So right there in 26, he's thinking about universalism, right? He says so. He says so. This is from his 38 history. Now, Universalists would talk about Plato a lot, okay? Because Plato was a near universalist, and then Christians, a lot of Christians who were influenced by Plato became full universalists like Origen, okay? So they would talk about Plato a lot. Universalists were, right? In the debates over is this legit or not, okay? And in a Universalist magazine, it cited this entry on Eon, right, that was found in the Encyclopedia Britannica, okay? So if you looked up Eon, A-E-O-N, right, it said, among the followers of Plato is used to signify any virtue, and again, Eon means eternal, any signify any virtue, attribute, or perfection. Hence, Platonist this is, they represent the deity as an assemblage of all possible eons, right? So eternal is a word that you can use for God, right? The deity, you can apply that to God, and therefore Universalists would use that to mean eternal punishment means God's punishment. It doesn't mean forever, which is exactly what it says in D&C 1911. Eternal punishment is God's punishment. So Joseph Smith literally uses not only a phrase that Universalists used, but a phrase that Universalists applied to Platonists, right? Follow me here, right? So it would be another way that Joseph Smith would have been pointing to Plato right at that time, right? So in 1826, he's looking at grimoires. In 1826, he's talking about universalism. Both of these things are pointing him to Plato, and he's got a patron who is probably supporting his education, okay? Which is kind of what he hints at in that statement from the trial, okay? So there would be reasons that he could have access to these things, all right? And then one of my favorite is when we get the statements on education being a wonderful thing in D&C 88, the olive leaf, right? So verses 77 and 79, it tells us of the importance of education. It says, teach one another the doctrine of the kingdom, of things both in heaven and in the earth and under the earth, okay? What's so interesting about these phrases is that they are the charge against Socrates in Plato's Apology. Socrates gets called before the court. They try him, they convict him, they execute him, right? And the Apology is his trial. And in it, this is the charge. It says Socrates acts wickedly. Now, again, Socrates is the hero, so Joseph Smith wouldn't have seen him as a bad guy, but the court did. He acts wickedly. And this is what he does. With criminal curiosity, investigates things under the earth, right? Same phrase we see. And in the heavens. And then just as they were, D&C 88 says, teach these things to others. That is one of the charges against Socrates. And he teaches these things to others. So D&C 88 actually uses, when it is endorsing education, it actually uses the charge against Socrates. And yes, I do believe Joseph Smith saw all these things, okay? All right. Joseph Smith owned Johann Lorenz von Mosheim's Institutes of Ecclesiastical History. He donated it to the Nauvoo Library. Now, we don't know when he procured it, but it was very, very popular. And so it would totally make sense for him to have access to that, and it being a wonderful source just to learn more about the history of Christianity. Mormons cite it a number of times in the Times and Seasons and various discussions of early Christianity. It was extremely popular, okay? Now, he would have had an opposite view of Joseph Smith, whereas his notion was that Christian Platonic philosophers had corrupted Christianity, right? And this is an idea that I've heard Mormons teach as well, right? It was a very Protestant idea that was very popular in Joseph Smith's day, and it had been popular for 100 years before, and it's still popular, if I'm not mistaken, right? You have this pure simplicity, and then all this Greek thought comes in and it corrupts it, and everything's messed up, right? And so Mosheim really, really promotes that, okay? And now, again, Joseph Smith would have totally rejected it because, again, Plato, not only in Plato's writings, but also as laid out by Mosheim, would have had the Mormon doctrines, Okay, and he would have been able to see that. So Joseph Smith, this is not an idea that he would have believed in, even though some Mormons have adopted it, right? And in it, Mosheim shares the views of an early Christian Platonic philosopher named Ammonius Saccas, who lived in Alexandria, and he was an important teacher for some other really important thinkers like Origen and Plotinus, okay? And Mosheim describes what he thinks was Ammonius's ideas about Jesus. And it says Ammonius taught that Christ's only intention was to purify the ancient religion, right? This is why I'm grabbing that title, the ancient religion, because Mosheim refers to it, okay? And that this early Christian philosopher had thought that Jesus only wanted to purify the ancient religion, and that his followers, meaning Christ's followers, had manifestly corrupted the doctrine of their divine master. So that Jesus had embraced the ancient religion again, and I'll show you the definition that Mosheim uses, but that had been corrupted later. And that again sounds a lot to me like what we see in the Book of Mormon, with a fuller truth in the Bible that then has truth removed later on. That reminds me a lot of 1 Nephi 13 about the loss of the plain and precious truth. So the point was to purify, not to purge. So there was additional truth, the embrace of the ancient religion that is then lost. Now, I just want to throw this one line in there because a lot of people object to this. This has been really, really popular. I've seen this all the time. That Mormonism is completely at odds with Platonism because God has a body. Now, certainly this is an aberration in Platonism, no doubt. But I just want to point out that in the available translation, the 1804 translation that was available on of Plato in Joseph Smith's time, in the Phaedrus, which again, you might have seen that term a few times because that does appear to be Joseph Smith's favorite of the Platonic dialogues. It says this great line in Taylor's translation: "We neither see nor sufficiently understand that God is a certain immortal animal." Now, again, animal, Plato, at least in the Taylor translation, simply defines as a being that has a body and a soul. Okay, and now again, I don't read the Greek and I don't know why it gets translated animal, but that's all it means, just a being with a body and a soul. Okay, and so it says God is a certain immortal animal endowed with a soul, possessing a body naturally conjoined with soul through the whole of time. So in the Phaedrus that was available to Joseph Smith, it flat out says that God has a body. Okay, so this notion of Joseph Smith was totally at odds with Plato by saying he had a body, that can't be true because that's what it says in the available translation that, yes, I do believe Joseph Smith read. Okay, and that earlier, just 2 pages earlier, well, 1 page actually, it defines what an immortal animal is. It says it's a being composed from soul and a celestial body. So it suggests God has this celestial body. Okay, so again, now it's true that Mormonism is going to be much, much more material than your typical Platonism, but it's much more of a you got to think of this more of a scale than something that's just in total opposition to Plato over this materialism, right? These issues are simply more complicated than that. Than they often get presented. So the idea of God as a body means you're an anti-Platonist. It's just much more complicated than that. So I would hold off on that kind of thinking. All right, now one of the things I really want to show, and sorry if there's a lot to this, and also sorry if you happen to see or hear my Sunstone presentation because I went over that just a month or two ago. I went over that what I'm about to show you. But one of the things I really want to really demonstrate the connection between the Book of Mormon and Plato, in my opinion, is the way that the Book of Mosiah matches a section from Andre Dossier's Works of Plato Abridged that he calls The Life of Plato. There's a very, very long discussion of the life of Plato. Now, this was a popular book. It goes through 3 editions in the 18th century. That is Works of Plato Abridged. It's not all the Plato. We don't get all the Plato in English until Thomas Taylor, the one that I was citing before, in 1804. But this has a handful of the dialogues and a lot of discussion of Plato. And he tells a story, okay? He tells a story that Plato was involved in, and it's a fairly long story. And it's about a Greek colony that gets set up on Sicily called at Syracuse. And it's established by a man named Dionysius the Elder. And how he's a Greek, he's surrounded by barbarians, and this, and I'll get into more of the details, I argue has many elements that's very similar in the Book of Mosiah, with Zeniff going down and establishing his colony, you might call it, the Nephites, surrounded by the Lamanites. And this is where things get more striking, okay? Because Dionysius the Elder has a problematic son, just like Zeniff has a problematic son. Dionysius' son is Dionysius the Younger, okay? And so when Dionysius takes over, he starts acting like Noah does. He has debauches that held for 3 months together, this Dionysius does. And he sought to have great equipages, superb palaces, sumptuous furniture, and fine clothes. These are the same thing that Noah does. So, right? So now we have these two parallels, right? He goes and establishes this colony surrounded by these people who are not like them, call them barbarians if you're a Greek, right? And then has this wicked son who acts just like Zeniff's wicked son, right? Now, here's where the story diverges a little bit. Dionysius the Elder had a brother named Dion, who was a follower of Plato. This occurs in Plato's lifetime. And Dion says to Dionysius the Younger, he says, "Look what a mess you are. You're a total debauched disaster. Let's go get Plato, and maybe he can reform you because he's this good holy thinker, right?" And Plato has some success with the younger Dionysius, but it's kind of ambivalent. And whereas it would seem in the Book of Mormon, the characters tend to be kind of one or the other. You for the most part, they're usually good or bad. You don't have characters like Dionysius the Younger who are sort of both, okay? So what I argue is that Joseph Smith seemed to kind of split these characters into two, right? So the wicked one, the wicked part of Dionysius is like Noah, whereas the reformed part is more like the sons of Mosiah. And I'll get to the sons of Mosiah in just a bit, okay? But let's kind of continue the story, because this is where things get really interesting, is that in Mosiah, the person that's brought in to reform all the people is Abinadi, okay? And Abinadi gets put on trial, and Abinadi's trial has a lot of similarities to Socrates' trial. Now, again, I talked about that, right? The charge against Socrates in the Apology, right? So it's called the Apology. That's Socrates' trial. And I'll just point out, these are all the lines from the Apology. And if you're familiar with Book of Mormon and Mormonism, you'll see some similarities, right? So Socrates says, "All my business persuade you, both the old and young, that you ought not to dote so much on your body, your riches, or other things you are fond of, but you should love your souls." So Abinadi tells them not to love riches, right? And then, of course, we have the famous part of the painting when they say, "Away with this man," and they're going to go get him. And Abinadi says, "You can't touch me." Socrates says something similar. He says, "Neither Anytus nor Meletus can hurt me. 'Tis impossible they should, for God does not permit that the better sort of men should be injured by those who are worse." Now, Socrates probably meant that in more of a moral sense, not that you'll actually be supernaturally smitten. But the concept is the wording sounds like a similar concept. They tell Abinadi he's got to be quiet. Abinadi says he won't, and Socrates is similar. He says, "My silence would be disobedience to God." Now, the similarities continue. Sorry, I left off the beginning quote there, but Socrates says to them, "No sooner shall you have put me to death, but the vengeance of God will pursue you more cruelly than you have shown me." Abinadi says it will be sort of the same, but with Socrates, it's actually be worse, right? So what you do to me is going to happen to you, right? And then in Dossier's footnote, he says this prediction was fulfilled in a raging plague that soon after laid Athens desolate. Now, we don't really get a description of plague in what comes afterwards, but that's actually one of the curses that Abinadi says. Plagues is one of the things that he actually warns them of, okay? And then we also get the similarity of the repentance that the people do after, the great punishment happens to them, right? So Noah's son Limhi, when Ammon comes down and they're all in bondage, they say, oh dear, we killed the God's prophet, and now we're being punished, and we what a terrible thing we did. And in Dossier's footnote, he says the Athenians repented their putting to death an innocent person and publicly lamented the loss of him. So again, we're seeing very, very similar things between Abinadi and Socrates' trial. Those similarities continue, all right? Because the Apology was the only one of Plato's dialogues where Plato actually shows up. Socrates refers to him. He says, "Oh, look, Plato's here." That's about all he says, right? Now, if we stop and think about this, is kind of significant, because with Alma the Elder, right? Alma the Elder is the one who's going to go and write down all the words of Abinadi. Well, who's the one who at least, would be mostly credited with writing down everything Socrates says, right? That would be Plato. That's what Plato, Plato's dialogues are almost always Socrates talking, right? And so in Enfield, this other book that I'm going to be referring to, it's his History of Philosophy. He refers to the trial and says, Plato, who was a young man, a zealous follower of Socrates, then rose up to address the judges, right? So again, we have Alma trying to do the same thing in defense of his master, right? Alma actually converts right on the spot versus Plato, who had been a follower before, but both tried to do this, right? But whilst he was attempting to apologize for his youth, right? It makes a point. Alma's very young. He was abruptly commanded by the court to sit down. Now, it's a little different. They actually chase off Alma. But they go off and do the same thing, right? Alma did write all the words which Abinadi had spoken. Again, this is what Plato is known for, writing the words of Socrates, okay? The similarities continue. So that was the example of the wicked part of Dionysius, right? Who acts like the wicked Noah. But then we also see sometimes Dionysius listens to Plato. And what's really, really interesting is the attempts that Plato uses to reform Dionysius are very, very similar to what we see with Mosiah's sons. Okay, so for instance, Plato advised Dionysius to undertake similar reforms. He says he advocated, so instead of kings, he says, let's have 35 guardians or conservators of the law, and that criminal matters should be judged by these 35. So instead of kings, you have what? You have judges, right? So that sounds a lot like what we get from Mosiah when he switches from kings to judges, right? But you were going to keep kings under Plato. He says you can keep kings for superintendence of sacred and religious matters. The king should not assist at judicial acts because being priests, they could not without defiling themselves, right? So instead of kings will not be like, kings really, they won't be political leaders. They're going to become religious leaders. And that's what both Alma, the younger, and the sons of Mosiah do, right? They put off political leadership and they take up religious preaching, right? So, and then it gets a little further because in Plato's Laws, another one of his dialogues, it talks about electing judges and there being different tiers, right? Remember, if with Mosiah, you're going to have this whole hierarchy of judges leading up to a chief judge, right? And it says that in Plato's Laws, it says judges choose the most principal court of justice, the most important one, by common consent. Now, that's a fun line because that shows up in the D&C. Now, one of the things that's also interesting, though, is that they don't have a single executive like we do in the Book of Mormon, a chief judge. But we are going to see something like that when I get to the research on pre-Columbian civilizations. So that will come up in a bit. All right. So again, this is just a summary of what we see. Again, my whole point is it really, really looks like this is not a coincidence. I don't see how you could get this many similarities. But the thing that really is striking to me is the question that I had before I came across this thing just recently that I felt like kind of answered it, which was why put the story in, right? Why take this adaptation of the life of the story of Dionysius the Younger, right? Why stick that in the Book of Mormon? I kind of wondered, right? Did Joseph Smith think it really happened? Does he think it's just a really good, I don't know, really good teaching tool? Why put that story in? I wonder. Now, again, I now have a theory. All right. And I'll get to that in just a bit. But first, let's go through this whole notion of ancient religion. Okay. So we have Mosheim attributing the idea of ammoniosakis. Sorry if I'm throwing around a lot of ideas, but if you remember what I put in the concept of ammoniosakis believing that Jesus had embraced the ancient religion, which is Platonism, but that had been corrupted. His teachings have been corrupted by his followers, meaning they seem to have suppressed the ideas, right? Mosheim defines the ancient religion as ideas coming from the Eastern nations, then through the Egyptians to the Greeks, right? So there's this long heritage, but that it was preserved in its original purity, that's an interesting word, by Plato. Plato had the most pure form of what the ancient religion was. That was the belief, okay? So this is a long idea. This idea you can find in antiquity, and it stays around, right? So that Mosheim is actually still referring to it, right? And I think the word purity is interesting because in 1 Nephi 13:25 it says these things go forth from the Jews in purity unto the Gentiles according to the truth which is in God. Okay, again, that was the truth that was fuller. The Jews had a fuller truth before the Great Involuntary Church removes it, right? So Joseph Smith would have been at odds with these thinkers, right? The problem was removing truth. It was not the addition of false doctrine that corrupted the purity of the truth. It was the removal of it, okay? All right. This other book, William Enfield's History of Philosophy. It was on sale in Palmyra, okay? Again, I think this would be something he would look at that would be available if you wanted more information on these ancient ideas, right? Now, for Enfield, the whole point of his book was to point out pagan, heathen, and Oriental corruption in Christianity, right? Mosheim and Enfield hated this idea of the ancient religion. They felt like it was wicked and corrupting, and they wanted to purge Christianity of it. So particularly Plato was really a bad guy. But the thing is the Book of Mormon really condemns people who would think like Enfield and Mosheim, saying, know ye not there are no nations in one? Know ye not that I, the Lord, your God, have created all man? And I bring forth my word unto the children of man, yea, even upon all the nations of the earth, right? So it's basically saying there's truth in all these nations. That's a real embrace of this notion of ancient religion. You can find truth everywhere, totally at odds with what these, again, Orthodox Protestant scholars were saying, right? Goes on to say, I shall speak unto all nations of the earth, and they shall write it. Again, a very, very radically, very at odds with Protestant ideas of sola scriptura, right? The Bible is the only thing that contains the truth. And Alma says something similar. In Alma 29, the Lord doth grant to all nations of their own nation and tongue to teach his word, yea, in wisdom, all that he seeth fit that they should have. Okay? So again, this is a total rejection of what Mosheim and Enfield were doing when they condemned the ancient religion. You see the Book of Mormon basically pushing back. Okay, so they would have had totally opposite views. Okay, now what I did here, they also point out that there's early Christian Platonists, guys like Ammonius Saccas, right? And there were a number of Christian philosophers who lived around the time of Ammonius Saccas. One who lived a little before him, named Clement of Alexandria. And to guys like Mosheim and Enfield, they saw these guys as super duper villains. Okay, and this is the description that Enfield gives of them. He says that they saw many truths dispersed, which they supposed to have been rays of heavenly wisdom, originally proceeding from the pure fountain of divine revelation. These relics of sacred truth, which they convinced to be scattered through the various sects of philosophy, they were exceedingly desirous to collect and to incorporate within the doctrine of Christianity, right? And one of the things, I think I might skip over this because this is maybe getting a little long, but in Moroni 7:11, Mormon gives a speech about how you can determine truth, right? And what he says is, if you have the light of Christ, you have the ability to go out and find all the truth. You don't need to worry about all these structures that are around you, right? And he says, a bitter fountain cannot bring forth good water. Neither can a good fountain bring forth bitter water. Now, it's interesting. Fountain is used in a rather similar kind of way, right? You can go out and collect all the truth because a pure fountain will bring forth good water, is what Mormon says, right? And then just as it says that there was truth scattered among various sects, this is something Joseph Smith says in 1843, if the Presbyterians have any truth, embrace that. Baptists, Methodists, etc. Get all the good in the world and come out a pure Mormon. So again, a similar idea, and again, once again, using this word pure, that purity is gathering the truth. It's not the worry about being corrupted by gathering truth, okay? Now, again, I do think I will skip over this a little bit more quickly so we can get to the Book of Mormon stuff. But the bottom line is that when Mormon goes through and gives his speech about how you can determine truth, he says, you will search diligently in the light of Christ, and you will embrace every good thing and condemn it not. This is rather similar to how Enfield describes the policy of Justin Martyr, who was another one of these Christian philosophers, but middle of the 2nd century, where it says, all good doctrine, according to him, proceeds from the Logos. Now, the Logos, again, is how John refers to Jesus. So talking about the light of Christ, that could be equated with the Logos, right? And on that account, wherever it is found, of right belongs to Christians. Again, saying something very similar that Mormon says in Moroni 7, where he says, all things which are good cometh from God, right? So we have attributed to Justin Martyr, all good doctrine comes from the Logos, right? Similar ideas. So again, we're going to get kind of the same ideas coming from how Enfield describes Justin. He says, oh, you can look at every tenet and writing of the heathens, right? Their ideas. Hey, if you go out and you look at all these nations, you're getting all this wicked doctrine. Again, something the Book of Mormon strongly condemns, right? No, you do go out and study all nations because God has given truth to all nations, right? And so as Joseph Smith says to Isaac Gallen, I believe this is 1839, the first fundamental principle of our holy religion is that we believe we have a right to embrace all and every item of truth without limitation or being circumscribed or prohibited by the creeds or superstitious notions of men, right? Protestants will say you can't go out and gather all the truth, right? Here you have Enfield mocking Justin for doing that, right? So Joseph Smith, again, takes an opposite view, okay? Now, one of the things that's actually interesting is Enfield even describes, he says, the first example of Platonic corruption is a non-canonical text that you might know of called the Shepherd of Hermas. And he says, it was full of, what does he call, philosophical fanaticism. The writer of the work certainly borrowed from the Platonic schools. Now, again, this is interesting because Shepherd of Hermas is not in the Bible. And Joseph Smith owned a book that contained the Shepherd of Hermas. This is William Hone's Apocryphal New Testament that strongly condemned the canonization process. It said this canonization process is bunk. Look at all these other texts, right? So Enfield literally gives an example of a book that he calls Platonic that was literally kept out of the Bible, right? So it's an actual example of what Joseph Smith was sort of talking about, right? Here's a book that he calls Platonic that's kept out, right? And Enfield also says, this is a fun line, he says, some Christian Jewish Platonists have even asserted that Moses wrote books now lost, from which Pythagoras, another Greek philosopher, and Plato drew a great part of their doctrine, right? So Enfield is attacking this idea, but he at least mentions it, that there are those who believe that Moses actually had books that have Platonic doctrine in them, okay? And again, it's interesting that what we get in the Book of Moses, we get an added missing text or additional text, right, that kind of flesh out Genesis. They come from Moses, and it's sort of like the Book of Mormon in the sense that it hints at some of these ideas of the fullness, right? So I think that's interesting too. Then he also gives examples, Enfield gives examples of the Neoplatonists, later Platonic thinkers who come after Jesus, and that they have a lot of these Platonic ideas because, they're followers of Plato, so they would. But he also describes them when the Christians then take over after Constantine in the coming centuries. He describes severe persecutions that are meted out on these philosophers, the worst of which was Hypatia, who had her body ripped apart and burned by a Christian mob. So I do think it's interesting that we also see in 1 Nephi 13:5, the great and abominable church slayeth the saints of God, yea, tortureth them and bindeth them down, and yoketh them with a yoke of iron, and bringeth them down into captivity. So that we also get, not only they're removing things from the Bible, they're persecuting the people who teach the ideas that are in line with the fullness of the gospel, okay? And that throughout their books, right, Mosheim was incredibly learned, and he thought that the worst villains were any kind of mystic with any kind of Platonic idea. And so he goes through and he describes these guys a lot, and he really, really hates them, but he often describes them being terribly, terribly persecuted. So that persecution doesn't necessarily just stop with the Neoplatonists, it also occurs with other mystics later on. All right. So, though Mosheim and Enfield wanted to attack the ancient religion and purge it from Christianity, they also gave abundant information on the narrative Smith proposed instead, which was there was a fuller truth that Orthodox church people, problematic attitudes like Mosheim and Enfield, had removed from Christianity and the scriptures, and persecuted people like the Neoplatonists who taught much of the fullness, okay? So he could have just simply flipped Mosheim and Enfield around, simply said these guys had the information, they just had it backwards, and thus promoted what we see in the Book of Mormon about the loss of the plain and precious truth, okay? All right, my last part. Sorry, this is a little long. All right. Why did Joseph Smith think that the Nephites had the fullness? And what I'm saying is there was actually some available scholarship that actually would have pointed him in this direction. Okay. And that was my big find that I have to include. Okay. So we have known about, this has of course been debated for, gosh, who knows how long, ever and ever, of that there were ideas that show up in the Book of Mormon that were popular about origins of Native Americans, right? Most notably, this idea of them being Israelites. That was been a popular idea around. People particularly point to Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews. Of course, that's been known for over 100 years. And he points out some similarities, maybe not a ton, but that there are some. One that's really, really interesting that he points out, and it's in the second edition. So the first edition is 23, the second edition is 25. He quotes Alexander von Humboldt's researches concerning the institutions of and monuments of ancient inhabitants of America, on what Humboldt says about the legends of a Quetzalcoatl. Now, this is a couple of Quetzalcoatl. This is not Quetzalcoatl, the god. This is the legendary king Quetzalcoatl Tepilson. I'm probably saying the name wrong. But is the guy who leaves and says going to come back, who Montezuma asked the Spanish about. In fact, both Ethan Smith and Humboldt talk about that. Talk about Montezuma saying that to them. Oh, are you the followers of Quetzalcoatl? So there was this legendary king, not the feathered serpent god, but the legendary king who's sort of like him. But anyway, they don't always make that clear. I watched a few videos before I did this just to figure all this out. Anyway, but the way that both Ethan Smith and Humboldt, some of the things that they describe about him, does have a few parallels to some of the things Jesus does when he visits the Nephites. Okay, so it says Quetzalcoatl does away with animal sacrifice. Jesus does that when he shows up. Quetzalcoatl undergoes, this suffering and great pain in order to appease the gods. Maybe a little different than Jesus, but we do, a bit like the atonement, I guess. Jesus ushers in a golden, this age of peace after Jesus does that. It says that Quetzalcoatl ushers in a golden age, and then Quetzalcoatl leaves and promises to return. And that actually is this myth that Montezuma was thinking of. But Jesus kind of does that also, right? So there's are these couple of things that parallel Jesus, right? But one of the things I think is most important about Ethan Smith, and I don't think we've explored this to the degree we should have, and I think this is kind of my big find. This is a long way to get this, is a couple of things. So first off, he's quoting von Humboldt's book, which I just mentioned, and von Humboldt just has unbelievable amounts of striking Book of Mormon parallels in his research. So I want to go through that I had not heard of. If anyone else had, I know we know of Humboldt, but I'm not sure we've used it to the degree we should have. But one that's really, really interesting is what the available encyclopedia says on Mesoamerica. And I don't think we've looked at that like we should have. Okay. So for instance, this the Real Big Kahuna Encyclopedia comes out in 1798. Is the third edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it was considered, the best one for a long, long time. Massive amounts of information. Then the Americans pirate it and sell it for cheaper, so it certainly would have been available. Okay, and it has this big 50-page entry on Mexico, in which it uses the research of a Mexican priest named Francisco Clavijero. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong. Who had done this tremendous research on pre-Columbian civilizations in Mexico. So it actually lays it out, all these pre-Columbian situations. However, it says we can't really get much before 462 CE, it says. Everything before that is just kind of mythology, and things aren't very clear. Now, again, I think that date's kind of interesting because, it's just a little bit after the Book of Mormon ends, right? So I think it kind of maybe helps frame the Book of Mormon in some degree, okay? And that what starts in 462, the entry says, is that you get the Toltecs. So it starts with this group, Toltecs, who are kind of a legendary group in Mesoamerica. But it also has a really important detail where it says that the Toltecs had a book, which according to the Spanish said that they had come from the Tower of Babel. Now, again, the dates would be wrong because these are after the Nephites, but still, that's got to jump out at us, right? There's this legend of the Tower of Babel, and it's mentioned in this encyclopedia entry, right? And it also mentions some other cultural traits, okay? It mentions them having gardens and that they're near towers, right? Because we're going to see Nephi, son of Helaman, being on a tower in his garden praying, okay? And it also talks about pre-Columbian civilizations in the Mexico area, building an aqueduct out of cement. Now, the reason why I'm really highlighting this, and I don't mean to, this is a jerky, obnoxious thing to do, but what had prompted all this is some of these videos that showed up on my YouTube feed of some of the defenses of Book of Mormon historicity, and again, it's not something I believe in, and surely not something to make fun of, but they had laid out these elements as sort of the big things that had linked the Book of Mormon to Mesoamerica, and had thrown out the line, and I think we should really be careful when we do this, because all my research has been on showing this is often not the case, but making the claims Joe Smith could not possibly have known. Well, these were all in the encyclopedia entry. Again, the cement one is actually one that really gets held up. And again, it talks about finding an aqueduct made out of cement. So there was knowledge prior to Joseph Smith and in a very available source of Mesoamericans using cement. So that would not have been in opposition. Now, one of the things that's also interesting, and they also mention gardens, but also has this tower aspect, which I think is really interesting, right? Because again, we see Nephi, son of Helaman with his tower, is that it also mentions Peru, right? So a view of the Hebrews likely would have pointed Joe Smith to maybe want to look up Mexico, because it says it's got this Quetzalcoatl guy who, again, has parallels with Jesus in the Book of Mormon. But now we have Peru. Now, the Peru entry isn't nearly as long as in form, but it does say some interesting stuff, okay? It's a lot shorter. And it mentions another mythical figure named Manco Capac, okay? And this is something that's going to come up more, right? And that is these legendary white people that Humboldt's going to talk a lot about. So this is a second one. So we have Quetzalcoatl, who's sort of like this, and now we have Manco Capac. And he arrives at Lake Titicaca, teaches the natives to be civilized. He founds Cuzco and the Incan Empire, okay? And he's another one of these figures. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is how the entry on Peru describes Inca religion, okay? And this is what I consider to be sort of the answers to my questions about why Joseph Smith would have thought the Nephites might have been Platonists, right? It says, the Peruvians were taught by Manco to adore the creator of heaven and earth, that intelligence which animated the world. Referring to a god as intelligence is something that showed up in a lot of Joseph Smith sources. And it's something that we see in Book of Abraham, chapter 3, where it says that God is more intelligent than they all, right? Because again, you see this in a lot of sources, and in a lot of Platonic sources, they refer to humans as intelligences also, but God is the top intelligence, right? So calling God that intelligence, that sounds rather Greek, or would have to Joseph Smith if he had been digging through this material, which I believe he was, because it all shows up in Mormonism, all right? Now we have some other Greek sounding stuff, right? And also things that are linked to the Book of Mormon, right? It says the Inca seldom offered sacrifice to God, right? Now, again, doing away with the sacrifices, just like Jesus does, and just like it says Quetzalcoatl does. But here we go a step further that sounds a lot like Jesus in the Book of Mormon. But worshiped him, God, with their hearts, right? Remember, the broken heart and the contrite spirit. So these Incas apparently had this correct policy that Jesus teaches the Nephites, right? Now we have, and is also Plato also, though sometimes he uses sacrifice, he also feels like the really high intelligent people will understand that maybe sacrifice isn't the best thing, and that it does need to be more internal. This is something that you find in Plato's writings also. Now, it also says the Incas built a temple to, quote, the unknown God. Now, what's really interesting is that in Acts 17:23, we have Paul going to Athens, very Greek place, and talking about the statue built to the unknown God. So this sounds rather Greekish, right? Particularly if you are a Bible reading, person, right? And Plato, it also fits Plato a little bit, because Plato says that the creator is hard to understand, okay? Now, this is where it gets really interesting, in my opinion, is because it says that the Inca had people call mentas, sorry if that's not right, and it says, or philosophers, so that their holy people were philosophers, all right? Okay, well, that sounds rather Greek. And again, philosophy, is what Plato's teaching, and it's in philosophy that you find the fullness, at least in Plato's philosophy, not any philosophy, but in Plato's philosophy, right? And he says, who delivered moral precepts and likewise cultivated poetry. Poetry sounds a bit Greek as well. Now, here's what's really interesting. It says, comedies and tragedies composed by those bards were acted on their festivals, okay? You add all this together, it sounds really Greek, right? They write comedies and tragedies, they have philosophers, and they refer to as intelligence, right? This is all very Greek sounding. And so this is why I kind of wonder. Now, again, the Inca would not be the Nephites. This is an existing civilization. When the Spanish showed up, the Nephites were wiped out, 1,000 or more years before that. But it does look to me, right, and this is something Ethan Smith says about Quetzalcoatl. He believes this is a legend, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it's actually Quetzalcoatl was actually a legend of Moses. And he says that this legendary stuff about the Bible had persisted in this culture. So that I do believe that Joseph Smith certainly could have looked at what the Inca were doing and felt that it was sort of an after, persistent of some Nephite ideas, okay? And again, there's even more that would have influenced Joseph Smith, particularly when we get to Humboldt. So we also have a bit of a geography, right? Mexico's in the north, Peru's in the south. They are divided by Panama, which is, narrow. And the encyclopedia entry on Darien, which is what Panama was called at the time, actually calls Panama a narrow neck. So that was actually a term that was used for Panama in Joseph Smith's day, right? It was literally in the encyclopedia. All right. So we have Mexico with some traits of the land northward, right? Claiming to come from Babel, using cement. And then, of course, Nephites do move into the land northward later in the Book of Helaman, so they could take their cultural traits like gardens and towers, right? And that we then see Peruvians with some of these Greek traits, okay? So I think, in my opinion, we're perhaps seeing a bit of a geographic, not just cultural, but somewhat geographical, with things going on in Mexico sounding a bit like the traits of the land northward, and things going on in Peru, right? Why, the question I had, why does Joseph Smith put in this very Plato story, right? Well, because in his sources, he's being told that the Peruvians act like Greeks, or, again, there's definitely some hints in that direction. Now, things get really, really interesting in Alexander von Humboldt's researches, right? This is the book that gets cited by Ethan Smith. Humboldt is going to repeat the Babel story. And he also throws out, he's kind of discursive, he's extremely well educated, but he's kind of all over the map. But he also adds the fact he isn't really so sure that these are Israelites, these Native Americans. But he does believe that there's maybe some evidence that they had Christianity preached to them a long time before the Spanish showed up. Now, that's very interesting because, of course, it's a major Book of Mormon theme that these guys are actually Christians. And that is actually proposed by one of the best and most well-educated and most knowledgeable on this topic, Humboldt. Actually proposes an idea that the Book of Mormon is going to propose. So Joseph Smith, if you read this, and I do think he did, would have seen that as perhaps some of the leading scholarship. Now, there's other things that's kind of interesting. For instance, he says that Mesoamericans had chapels built like towers. And to me, that's kind of interesting because Nephi prays on his tower, right? So just adding that little extra thing, right, I think it's kind of interesting. Now, again, he doesn't argue for Israelite origins. He says that the Native Americans probably came from Asia across the Bering Strait from the Mongolia and the Tartars, which is basically correct. But then he even adds that maybe the Christianity that gets spread to them long time ago and maybe come across in the same sort of way. So we do have Joseph Smith perhaps pushing back. Now, one of the things that's interesting, though, is just a handful of other things that Humboldt says. So one of the things is he expands the scope geographically. He's very interested, again, in this legendary Toltec culture, and he thinks that there's evidence of it up in Canada and Kentucky. So we are, so the idea of things spreading out from Mesoamerica would have been promoted by Humboldt as well, because he says that you see these cultural traits in Canada and Kentucky. He does these massive religious comparisons all over the world just to try to figure out what's going on with these Mesoamericans. And then one thing that's particularly interesting is he goes back in time a little bit, right? Whereas the encyclopedia entry says, let's not go back before the Toltecs, 462 CE. Humboldt mentions, he says, there are these other civilizations that call themselves older, like the Olmecs and this other, I won't even try to pronounce that. And he says something really interesting. He says, those Olmecs pretended to have found giants when they arrived in the area, right? They found these giants. And then in another line, Humboldt tells of a Peruvian tradition about a colony of giants who mutually destroyed each other, right? Now, again, the idea is that these would have been legends. These aren't necessarily, full on factual, but that you would have had legends about a pre-civilization predating some of these groups, and that they had actually wiped each other out, which is, of course, what the Jaredites did. All right. Now, the thing that most strikes Humboldt are these mysterious white people. Okay. Because Humboldt he's very taken with Quetzalcoatl, which again is what Ethan Smith quotes. Ethan Smith quotes his Quetzalcoatl information. Again, Ethan Smith thinks, oh, this is Moses. And then again, the Peruvian one brings up Manco Capac. I spelled that wrong. Sorry, it's Manco, not Monaco. Sorry. And then Humboldt adds one more, a legendary figure named Bochica, who brings the same sort of civilization, but to another area, Bogota. Okay. And again, what Ethan Smith says about Quetzalcoatl has generally been the fact that events in pagan mythology, which are founded on ancient revelation, have yet been confused and blended with much fable, right? So you have to kind of piece it together. Again, Ethan Smith thinks that Quetzalcoatl is a legend about Moses, whereas he kind of matches more Book of Mormon aspects of Christ's visit, right? And what I would notice is that there's these similarities between the way that Humboldt describes these three characters, Quetzalcoatl, Manco Capac, and Bochica, that have similarities not only to Jesus, but what we also see with Nephi and Mosiah II, okay? So first and foremost, these are white bearded men, and Humboldt's really taken by that. He's like, what's going on? Why do they have these stories, right? And he's like, some people think maybe they're the Vikings, what's going on? And he actually just leaves it an open question. He doesn't know. He doesn't know why you have these white guys bringing civilization, but he's really interested in it, all right? Now, Nephite whiteness is a big deal in the Book of Mormon, as we all know, right? It says that the European colonists were white and exceedingly fair and beautiful, like unto my people. There is this racial equation between the Nephites and the Europeans. Of course, this brings up the question of why did Joseph Smith thought that these Semitic people were white like the Europeans? And my guess is because all the Bible pictures that were around, they look not just white, but super white. I was kind of scanning through that. They're like Bible pictures from the 17 and 1800s. Everybody's like pasty white. So I'm guessing that's it. Your average Joe just sort of figured that everybody in the Bible was like super white. I guess I don't know if anyone else has a theory on that, but the bottom line is, he really makes clear that these Nephites are white, and what's really, really important is that Humboldt really, really makes a big deal about the whiteness of these three figures, right? And he's going to mention some others as well. So anyway, this is a connection we can get between Nephites and what Humboldt describes, okay? And it's not, he also describes both he and Ethan Smith, a few other traits of Quetzalcoatl, right? So it isn't just the ones, so there's a handful that kind of sound like Jesus in the Book of Mormon, but then there's some others that also sound a bit like Nephi, right? So we have Quetzalcoatl yielded to the entreaties of the inhabitants who offered him the reins of their government. So they really try to get him to lead, and Nephi, the same thing happens to him, right? Came to pass that they would that I should be their king. I did for them according to what was in my power. So they both kind of do this. The people are trying to talk to him. Nephi does something a bit like Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl, right after this, it says, well, 20 years among them, and taught them to cast metals. Well, Nephi does the same thing, to teach my people to work in all manner of iron and copper and brass and steel and gold and silver, right? So there's another thing that Quetzalcoatl does, right? And then also it's kind of interesting because he's the founder of monasteries and congregations. And it says, King Mosiah granted unto Alma, so this would be a similarity with Alma, that he might establish churches throughout all the land of Zarahemla. So my notion is that some of these legendary figures get kind of divided up into aspects of some of the key figures of the Book of Mormon, right? And again, coming back to what Ethan Smith has said, this is all going to be kind of jumbled, and you have to kind of go back and find the grain of truth, right? Then we have another really interesting character named Bochica, right? He brings civilization to Bogota, and it says that when he does so, he named, quote, 2 chiefs between whom he had divided the civil and ecclesiastical authority. So he has sort of the separation of church and state, but among chiefs. Now, this is interesting because Plato is going to talk about these reforms in which he switches, right, from kings to judges, but there isn't a single executive, right? But here we have the mentioning of such a figure, and he's a chief, right? What is it? It's a chief judge in the Nephites, right? Now, of course, the Americans have their chief justice, which would be similar, but he isn't the executive like the chief judge is, right? So here so it does kind of sound like a bit of a blending. The chief judge sounds like a bit of a blending of this quality that the Bochica brings to Bogota, two chiefs, one's over the civil, right? But again, the big deal that we see in the Book of Mormon is that Mosiah II really, really stresses this separation, right? So regarding sinners, so Mosiah gives the authority to Alma to set up those churches, and then when Alma goes to him and says, "Look at our wicked sinners," King Mosiah said to Alma, "Behold, I judge them not. Therefore, I deliver them into thy hands to be judged," right? So we have this separation. Mosiah doesn't claim authority over ecclesiastical matters, which would make him sort of like Bochica, right? He's the one who sets this up. He's a king. And then after him, he's the last king. We're going to have a chief judge, right? And there's going to be the separation that he has started under his leadership, right? And they're all lawgivers. Bochica, Manco Capac, and Quetzalcoatl, all lawgivers to their people. And that's something Mosiah II does, right? So we have kind of these mixed traits of these white-bearded men, right? So among Quetzalcoatl, Manco Capac, and Bochica, we see particularly traits of Nephi, Mosiah II, and Jesus, right? As though Joseph Smith is looking at these stories and kind of thinking, all right, something real and scriptural is happening here, and I have to just kind of go back and piece it all and sort it all out, right? Now, one of the things that's interesting is that he says these aren't the only white people, okay? He hears a legend about some remains of those edifices at Lake Titicaca that seem never to have been finished. And at the arrival of the Spaniards, the natives attributed the construction of them to a race of white-bearded men, right? So keep saying this. And so there's these structures at Titicaca built by white-bearded men who inhabited the ridge of the Cordilleras long before the foundation of the empire of the Incas. Now, I think that's a very big deal too, right? So apparently there was a civilization before the Incas who were white-bearded men, and they left their buildings unfinished. And he also tells the story of another group, sort of these, hunter-gatherer groups in the Amazon of Ecuador, who have these books. And he wonders, are they the scanning remains of some civilized nation fallen into a savage state? He wonders if they're the Toltecs, and he says, these are interesting questions for elucidating the history of man, the importance of which have not hitherto been sufficiently felt. But he leaves this as an open question. He's like, I don't know what's going on. We have these really, really interesting stories. I wish I kind of knew what was going on. Well, it really, really fits what I think we see in the Book of Mormon, right? That we have this lost civilization prior to this, and they're doing these Nephite things, right? And so it looks like we have kind of this combination between Ethan Smith and Humboldt, right? Because Smith had really pushed Israelites. Humboldt says no, but of course, this is where you get in the Book of Mormon. We get these white Nephites. They have this ancient religion. In other words, things like the Greeks. We see these Greek things going on in the Book of Mormon, right? They have these great leaders who are done things ascribed to the bearded men, right? So Christ brings the golden age, no more sacrifice. He suffered to appease, promises to return. Nephi's got the metallurgy. He's compelled to lead. Mosiah II is a lawgiver who separates church and state, right? All aspects that we see among Humboldt's white bearded men. Now, there's also a geographic aspect to all these, because these guys show up in different places, right? One of the things that's interesting, of course, as we all know, tons of debate over where the Book of Mormon takes place, and people get kind of worked up about this. There is that very, very interesting line in a note from Frederick G. Williams about Lehigh Landing in Chile at the 30th parallel. That's fairly far down south, right? I believe it's at the town La Serena. And it's also interesting that after landing, Nephi and followers journey many days to the land of Nephi, right? So in order to flee from Laman, who's trying to kill him, right? They go many days, and the whole orientation would be north. He doesn't say it there, but the whole orient is kind of a north-south thing. So is it possible, he's moving north? Probably. Now, one of the interesting things is that the legend of Manco Capac, the white-bearded man, has him landing at Titicaca. And that's what the entry on Prue says. And what's interesting is that Humboldt has the legend of a white civilization at Titicaca prior to the Inca. All right, so we have a couple of places, right? We have, again, the statement that seems to be from Joseph Smith about maybe landing down in Chile. North of Chile is Titicaca, something to think about, right? It says that that this white civilization left unfinished buildings. One of the reasons why they might have been in Phyllis is maybe they were attacked and they had to flee, right? Now, Mosiah I is, quote, commanded to flee out of the land of Nephi. And again, he heads north. Where does he go? He goes north, but it says it's down to Zarahemla, all right? And it makes a real big deal that Bogota, this is in Humboldt, Bogota is in a valley. So you would go down geographically into Bogota, even if you were headed north. And again, Bogota is where Bochica went, right? So we have another geographical location. It is where Bochica goes. And that's where Bochica acts like Mosiah II. What Mosiah II does in Zarahemla, right? Gives laws and separates church and state. So let's just kind of think about, based on this, on these sources available to Joseph Smith, they lay out a bit of a geography, right? So first off, we have a land northward where we got some land northward things, right? They come out of Babel, they use cement. In between, there's a narrow neck, which is what they're called in the, what's called in the encyclopedia, right? And then we have to the south, right? To the south, particularly down Peru, I put law and southward actually over Bolivia, but no, not Bolivia, Colombia, but anyway, down south, we got Peru down there, right? So there's a kind of a basic divide here. I know I'm not saying it had to be the entirety of all the of both continents, but we do have kind of a basic divide between north and south with a narrow neck in between, right? Now, Humboldt adds a couple of things, right? So we have white people before the Inca building unfinished buildings, right, down at Lake Titicaca. That's kind of my little square down there, right? Lake Titicaca, we got the pre-Incan whites, right? And then up here, that's where so down south is where Manco Capac had shown up, but Bogota is where Bochica had gone. And again, Bochica does things like Mosiah II, right? And again, we're also told that Mosiah I flees the land of Nephi. He goes northward. He goes down into Zarahemla. Also, Bogota is also a valley, okay? Humboldt really makes a deal that this is a valley at Bogota, okay? All right, so if we just kind of think about that, Bochica goes to Bogota, right? Sort of in between these areas. It would fit geographically. Could that be? And again, he acts in the Zarahemla sort of way. Mosiah II, Bochica does this. He separates the church and state. He appoints a chief over the government. So does Mosiah, right? We see these things. Grandfather Mosiah I, he flees out of the land of Nephi. He goes northward. He goes apparently into a valley because he goes down. Bogota's a valley. Just keep saying these things, right? It is closer. Zarahemla is closer to the narrow neck of land. They move up further. There is you're going to get Bountiful, which is even closer to the narrow neck of land. So there's a little distance there, but you're getting pretty close with Zarahemla, according to the Nephite geography, right? So just to kind of summarize this up, Humboldt and entries on Peru most likely provided the basis of Book of Mormon geography, it would seem to me. Smith was never very definitive, and it's likely he might have been a little uncertain, didn't want to totally nail this down, right? Because, he might have really believed, okay, well, these are very, very ancient, based on what Humboldt's saying. Maybe I should be a little careful about really pointing this out. But it is interesting that line about landing in Chile, right? Now, as we all know, Joseph Smith would have thought of natives in North America as Lamanites as well. And again, Humboldt makes the point about this Toltec culture spreading into Canada and Kentucky. So that would also give that notion of spreading, right? Humboldt's super interested in this mysterious white people. And it's almost as though Smith wanted to propose a solution to what Humboldt was talking about. Smith is going to draw on other details. There's lots of Book of Mormon narrative points in Jane Lead. And again, get into Jane Lead, but there is a bunch of Book of Mormon stuff in her. So this isn't everything that he could have drawn on from the Book of Mormon. But I do think that this likely gives us both cultural and geographical traits. That's how it seems to me. So this would sort of be basically perhaps kind of what he could have been getting, right? So Lake Titicaca kind of looks like perhaps that's the land Nephi. Zarahemla at Bogota. You can land down in Chile and you can move your way through it. Then you got, again, the narrow neck and then up to the land northward, right? So that's how I think all this stuff blends together. Overall, my argument, Joseph Smith felt called to restore the fullness of the gospel that was found in the ancient religion, which is mainly Plato. He was likely highly intrigued by natives and claims about their origin, and would have found reasons for the claims the Book of Mormon made. Uses Ethan Smith for the Israelite origins, and then Humboldt to talk about these places and this lost civilization. Nephites would be the answer to Humboldt's mysterious white people. My larger takeaway is Smith producing the Book of Mormon is a remarkable achievement. I don't, if you want to throw that, well, how does he do it? I agree, it is remarkable. I am a believer in practice Mormonism without believing in the historical Book of Mormon. I've done that for about 12 years, including the whole time I was bishop. In my amateurish way, I've noticed a lot of biblical scholarship calls into quite a bit of question the historicity of the Old Testament. So this is certainly going on with other scriptures as well. And my sense is that there's a lot of scholarship that talks about heavy Greek influence in the New Testament. So again, this notion of there being something bad about Greek, it looks like New Testament looks pretty Greek to me. Even to the point that some scholars have even argued that the Old Testament may have followed Plato's instructions in producing a text. Anyway, that's my presentation. Basically what I'm saying, sorry if that was kind of thrown off kind of quickly, but I'll just say that this is maybe a better way to summarize it, that seeking to practice the ancient religion as Joseph Smith would have thought of it, I think has a lot of merit and a lot of value, and do see Mormonism, which actually does do that, because we do have all this Platonic doctrine, does look like a good religion to me, and is one that I am happy to practice. That might be a better way to summarize that. Anyway, that is the end of my presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was extremely enlightening and rich. I'm wondering if you would be open to answering questions from the audience
Of course.
gathered this evening.
Of course.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Fleming?
You have any questions, Trevor?
Oh, I've got lots of questions, but I want to give others the opportunity before I jump in.
I don't have any questions, but I do have a comment on, so not taking away any idea of a secret tradition, right? This fullness you're talking about. I do think it's interesting that Joseph Smith, in his early revelations, does refer to the Book of Mormon as having the fullness of the gospel. We have it in section 20, section 27, section 35, right? That the Book of Mormon contains the fullness, or that Joseph Smith has sent in the past, right? Past tense in section 35. God speaking, I sent the fullness of the gospel through Joseph Smith. And then in section 39, we get this definition of the fullness of the gospel in verse 11, where it kind of refers to, so I think fullness of the gospel might be a little more technical of a term, rather than just kind of like you've defined it as inclusive of all the premortal existence concepts and temple marriage and all those kinds of things. It seems in section 39 that it's really just defined as the covenant, so if you think about the Abrahamic covenant concepts, which I think probably would include, well, I won't go into that, but just the idea that if you enter into this covenant, right, you can receive land, you can receive the idea of priesthood, and also kingship and queenship, and then the promise that would continue through your seed as an inheritance. And so So I guess I'm just maybe pointing that out just so that using those texts, you might want to look at that phrase "fullness of the gospel" a little bit differently than what you've defined it.
Okay, no, that's a good point. And yeah, I do think he's over the map. Sorry, it does seem as though, yeah, there's difference of, it seems to get used differently. But yeah, again, I do have, again, that concept of that there is this plan of salvation concept. It's going to get laid out,
Yeah, and I do think yeah, I think that, again, it doesn't take away that there is a secret tradition, that perhaps contains more, but fullness seems to be more limited in its scope, and
Okay.
the Book of Mormon contains it. Yeah.
I'll explore that further. Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Oh, and then I guess my other question was just about Humboldt. Tell me again, was there any evidence Joseph possessed it, had access to it, read it?
Again, yeah, we don't. I mean, everything about Joseph's books, it doesn't really seem to be a full disclosure thing. Like, for instance, when he turns into the 39 books, he turns into the Nauvoo library. It's really kind of the only evidence that he even possessed them. So there really isn't any kind of much of a paper trail, and we certainly don't know that that's all the books he had. He doesn't seem to be particularly forthcoming on what he knew and what he read. And that's actually fairly common for visionaries to downplay. So you're going to see the same thing in a lot of people like Swedenborg and others to kind of downplay what it is they're reading. There's a real sense of, sounds better if you just say it's just God in the Bible. And again, I don't mean that in a cynical way, but I'm just saying that there is a trend there that you can see that. My sense is, yeah, I don't have the smoking gun of ownership, but just simply being that, I would say what I would point out is this is a topic that interests him. It's something that Ethan Smith had pointed to. Again, there's connection with Ethan Smith through Albert Cowdery. My sense of Ethan Smith could track the book down. Again, it would seem as though this would be something that would certainly have interested him. So again, we can always sort of debate those things, but again, in my opinion, it's like this would be something he would have wanted to have tracked down, particularly if he would have had access to Ethan Smith, which I think he would have.
Yeah. Well, I think the parallels were pretty cool.
There's even more, but the other ones get kind of technical. So, but those were interesting. Thanks, John.
Other questions?
Yeah, so that question / comment kind of ties into that. So my area of interest is mainly around altered states of consciousness and like the scientific research behind that. And that stems from me going through my own experience and reconciling it with science and my hard science background. My experience, not knowing like any Eastern tradition, Eastern philosophy, was that I experienced a lot of concepts that later, when I looked into Buddhism and Hinduism, fit in. There's a lot of overlap between these like mystical, non-dual experiences, although in different cultures they get represented differently. Like if you read, the Tao Te Ching, there's a lot of overlap with Plato, although there's probably not, a direct horizontal connection. And there's some interesting, like A Course in Miracles is an automatic writing sort of channeled book that was from a psychologist who raised Baptist, but an atheist, and then started getting these messages from Jesus Christ so it's from a Christian lens, but it's very mystical and non-dual. And so like the theme I see in this, so yeah, my question to you is like, where do you feel Plato got the ideas? That the theme I see in this is that there's a lot of altered states of consciousness, whether like endogenous or exogenous. Like John Hopkins studies are showing that the mystical experience is really no difference whether it's like a religious mystical or through psilocybin. They have these really fairly well-defined criteria, and that's to me the biggest like evidence I think for Joseph Smith being probably a pious fraud, is that like he nails so many of these like ineffability, transcending space and time, these things that he just wouldn't be able to get, in my opinion, without having some experiences, whether like the first vision is some sort of composite or whether it was an actual thing. But yeah, you know, and the Book of Mormon too, there's so many instances of these altered states of consciousness, you know, Sons of Messiah, Alma the Younger, King Lamoni, not to mention like Nephi and Lehi. So I see that as a bit of a psychoanalytical, lot of elements that in these automatic writing pieces, you know, people can be sincerely believing that they're coming from another source. And I think through an idealistic perspective, there's a case for that. And they've got MRI studies that show that these Brazilian channelers, you know, their writing and their language centers and their motor centers are not really active while they're doing it. So, so that's the, you know, with the peyote being used in Native American, mushrooms in the Mazatec, and then Plato's connections to Eleusinian mysteries, and I think good conjecture that there is psychedelics there. What are your thoughts on that connection, or where Plato got these ideas? And you can be academic or spiritual.
I'll be both. Now, again, you know, I mean, you know, the academic thing with Plato, maybe I should even, you know, defer to Trevor, who's the classicist. But yeah, I mean, you know, yeah, they're picking up on philosophical things that had been around, and Pythagoras is really important, and he's always attributed. But Plato did do some travel around, and he's very interested in Egypt. So there's definitely so even, you know, the idea that they're throwing around this ancient religion, we wouldn't really call it that today, but yeah, I mean, of course, Plato gets ideas from his antiquity. They you know, they go back, and I mean, even drawing connections over in India and Buddhism. I mean, this is all Indo-European culture that would have things going on in common, coming out of you know, some antiquity, but going back. So yeah, there's definitely a cultural heritage that Plato can draw on. We don't always, it's always a little hard to trace things. And sorry, jump in here if I'm getting this wrong, but sometimes, you know, Plato writes a ton, and we don't get a lot of writers who write that much before him. So it's a little, you know, we would have wished, you know, if Pythagoras could have done something like that, what a blessing it would have been. But Pythagoras was actually really tapping into that esoteric thing. You don't write things down. That was a very, very common idea, yeah, of not writing down higher holy truths. Now, getting into the altered states, again, I think I've mentioned, you know, it's not really my expertise. There is that interesting thing about Socrates' daemon, and so where he believes he's receiving this kind of revelation from his spirit guide, which is pretty interesting. And people talked about that all the time in Joseph Smith's contemporary sources about Socrates, of what we make sense of, what is that thing that's guiding Socrates. In terms of other kinds of stuff in Joseph Smith, you know, I don't know, I don't really know. That's not really my expertise, but I don't know if Trevor, if you want to talk more about antiquity or.
Well, I would recommend, of course, Gabe probably has read Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key, which is kind of a handy, popular collation of a lot of different studies that have been done on, you know, both, you know, textual studies and archaeological studies showing the use of psychedelics in ancient Mediterranean religion So, Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key, would be one place to go, and he'll lead you to other sources from written by classicists and archaeologists. But then I would also probably recommend to you Peter Kingsley's work. There's one book in particular I'm thinking of right now, although all of them are worth looking at. But the one I'm thinking about is In the Dark Places of Wisdom, where he talks about pre-Socratic philosophers engaging in incubation practices, as they were called, but he believed that these were states of ecstasy and revelation, whereby these early philosophers were receiving what they viewed to be divine revelation, which was the source of their wisdom. And Plato falls into this tradition. He's, I think, not unfairly accused of kind of mining the materials that sources like the Pythagoreans had passed down, and kind of claiming them as his own, to stick to a theme that we've heard before this evening, that you don't necessarily reveal where all of your divine wisdom is coming from. It can be coming from someplace, but that also doesn't negate the possibility that even Plato himself either had experience with psychedelics. Clearly, the Eleusinian Mysteries would have been one possible place where that could have happened. I tend to fall in the camp of those who think that psychedelics were used in the Eleusinian Mysteries, but that isn't necessarily the only place where he could have had mystical experiences that informed his philosophical views. So that's just kind of a from my trove of classics knowledge, weighing in on that particular issue.
Yeah, I like Brian Murarescu's book, and I think it just makes the, having a horizontal transfer and a vertical transfer possible makes the correlation causation problem very tricky. And my experience was interesting because my experience was an endogenous experience, and then later tried psilocybin. I was like, oh, this is the exact same place.
Yeah.
So, and there's some good studies showing like the correlation between that. So, yeah, in terms of, so I've seen a lot more connection with Joseph Smith. What seems interesting with Joseph Smith, and I view him very kind of Jungian in terms of, his parts being expressed in the Nephites and the Lamanites and a lot of these things that he later ends up doing, getting condemned in the Book of Mormon. But it seemed, during my experience, there was a lot of kind of apophatic, paradoxical thoughts. But it seems like that's what Joseph Smith struggles a lot with. Very kind of black or white, swinging from like the Nicene Creed to like, no, God has a body, he's a man. And so that's what I've been interested in seeing, how he seems to may have struggled with reconciling the paradoxes in his mind.
Well, and I think, one of the things I really, and sorry to continue, but one of the things I really appreciate about Joseph Smith and the totality of his prophetic career is that, he seems to be grabbing at, different parts of the elephant, so to speak. The story about the philosophers, the blind philosophers, or Gymnosophist and the elephant, where they're each touching a different part. At different parts of his development, he has different expressions of what he sees as the divine truth. Sometimes I think, and here I would point particularly to the work of my friend Don Bradley, that and others, others I think would also agree with this, that what historians and good historians, I'm not casting aspersions on their efforts, but we have a tendency to want to periodize things and see them as kind of an evolution. And Don Bradley's work has been really illuminating to me to show that a lot of the themes that get later played out in the Nauvoo period endowment, the temple ceremonies, were already sort of present in a different form in Joseph Smith's ideas as early as the 1820s, the late 1820s. And so, what is that informed by? Well, if we're following what Stephen is sharing with us, that some of that is that he was already encountering rather profound wisdom that he was gleaning from sources at hand. But to that, I think we can add the genuine mystical or spiritual experience, the revelatory experiences that he has, and those two things can work together. And we don't need to necessarily resolve the tension, as people so frequently struggle to do as they're trying to understand Joseph Smith and exactly what he was up to. So those are very interesting questions and insights that you bring to the table, Gabe. Thank you. All right. Maxine, I'm sorry, Stephen, Maxine has a question. Maxine, can you unmute?
Oh, okay. That Joseph is restoring what he sees as, the ancient religion, which is, not what I call Gnostic Christianity, and most people and you call Christian Platonism, into Mormonism. But would you summarize really quickly? Is it Enfield and Mosheim, and then Jane Lead are as the three chief sources? What do you see as the chief sources that Joseph believes and uses? Because it's interesting that the Enfield and Mosheim books are, critiquing, they're critiquing Christian Platonism, as the Christianity that's evil and bad and fell away. And it is, so do you want to elaborate a little bit on why that would inspire Joseph? Does it inspire his rebellious, dissenting, apocryphal side? And what do you think are the chief sources for him of which you've kind of outlined, but I just wanted you to kind of summarize and clarify the chief sources for him. Or is it those three, or what else would you say?
No. I put it a little differently. I would say the sources themselves are a little bit of a story. Again, we've talked a lot about this. First and foremost is Jane Lead, which I did not mention in this.
Right.
But what I actually do is I kind of break it up into different types. And this doesn't necessarily call it all, but I kind of say, and I think we might have even talked about this, but I say that there's kind of two major types. And this isn't, I might have to tinker with this a little bit, but I say that the two different types I would call the family sources and what I call the study sources. And the things that he appears to be getting from his father. He's getting sources, but he's also getting attitudes, right? And so Jane Lead's the big one, but I also think there's a handful of others. We don't have to lay them all out. John Dee would be one. We've talked about that. But Jane Lead's the big kahuna. She's more than 50% of the whole product. But that he's getting an attitude from his father that there's also in Jane Lead is this really strong seekerism, that the contemporary churches are all false. We're waiting. Again, Jane Lead this really lays this out. The true church is coming, and it's going to be like this. And Jane Lead's a Christian Platonist. He wouldn't have known that inherently. I don't think the father really would have gotten that either. But what you would hand is tremendous religiosity that his father was on board with, which is what I argue, right? Comes from the uncle Jason. Sorry if I gave this paper at Sunstone and it's a long one, and then everyone wants me to summarize it in 3 minutes, and it's hard. But there's this family tradition that's coming that looks like Jane Lead's coming in from Uncle Jason, converts his father. His father's got this tremendous animosity towards the established churches, and this is going to be both a product and fed by Jane Lead, because she again is promoting the secretism. There's no true church on the earth. We are waiting for this perfect church to come. Father and Joseph become convinced that Jane Lead's prophecies are about Joseph Jr. He is the one who was called to implement Jane Lead's prophecies, right? So it's a spiritual interpretation of these sources. He's the one who's called to do it, right? But so even before everything I laid out here, he would have had all this background, which I didn't go into, right? Which is the family source, right? Which would be the Jane Lead. There's some John Dee, some other kinds of things, but the grimoires would be another family source what the father would have been using, and then the universalism as well. But then there's this second step that I think happens, and again, you have to kind of guess when it might have happened. But and again, I think 26 when he's doing the study. Now you have to understand that the family sources were going to make up the something like 70-75% of the totality of Mormonism. There's the vast majority, because Jane Lead's in the 60s or something in terms of the percentage of her influence. So that most of Mormonism is would have been worked out, because most of it's in Jane Lead, right? But then he enters in the second step, which is, again, he's being pointed to Plato, and what he's able to do with Plato and with Enfield and Mosheim is to put together a historical theology, right? What happened and what went wrong. Now, he doesn't have sources that's going to lay it out like he would like. So what he does is he's going to take Enfield and Mosheim and turn them on their heads, right? They argue this is the corruption. And then again, just like that example of saying, Enfield saying, the perfect example of the first example of Platonic corruption is Shepherd of Hermas, right? Well, of course, Shepherd of Hermas is not in the Bible. It'd be a clear example of a suppression of this higher truth that he thought that he, an example of something that's missing. And so again, Mosheim and Enfield, there's a tradition of doing this, right? Of everybody considered Mosheim to be the absolute, and it was Mosheim spent like 50 years writing. Think about that. Mine's taking a long time. Mosheim wrote his books for 50 years. He covered everything. He was the most knowledgeable of Christian history. He was he used all primary sources. Yeah. And it was unbelievable what he did. And yet he had a very, very clear agenda. But we have like an example of this, because John Wesley's attitude was, hey, look, everybody's going to use Mosheim. He's the best. But what he comes out and says is, Mosheim doesn't truly understand Wesley's idea of what true Christianity was. So he feels that Mosheim messes up the good guys and bad guys sometimes, right? So he says, Mosheim's really attacking the Montanists, and he thinks the Montanists are good. Mosheim really loves Augustine. Wesley doesn't like Augustine so much, right? So there was these precedents of people reading Mosheim through a different lens. Now, Joseph Smith's lens would have been much more radical than Wesley's. I mean, almost like a 180 flip, but you could do that. You could absolutely read it and say, black is white and white is black, and you could get a totally esoteric version of Christianity, because they go through the esoteric stuff in a ton of detail, because they hated it, and they wanted to spell it out and show how it destroyed Christianity. So you can read it, you can totally get the whole picture. Right,
like Irenaeus making Gnosticism available through the attack. And so you think that Joseph would have had to have, and very likely did, read them and consult them, and was actually inspired by their denunciations.
Well, yeah. He owned Mosheim. And then again, there's other books that are like that, right? So things that would talk about with say Kabbalah, for instance, were these kinds of books, usually really, really denouncing them. That's why I argue that, like in Alma, I can't remember, it's 27 or 29, right? The Bible, we have a Bible. Really looks like it's attacking Protestant attitudes of attacks on Kabbalah. I would need to explain that a little bit, but anyway. But yeah, there's a real, that is it 27 or 29? I'm sorry, I'm getting this where he attacks sola scriptura.
Who attacks?
Is it 2nd Nephi 27 or 2nd Nephi 29? Anyway.
Oh, I don't remember. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, that is a real attack on these kinds of guys, right? Of saying, no, all truth is in the Bible. all truth is in the Bible, and you're not going to get it. You're not going to get anywhere else. And again, there was a long held ideological battle between these Orthodox Protestants. But these Orthodox Protestants are the ones who wrote the most learned books, and so it would be kind of hard to get this thing pieced together by others. Now, one that he could have used was in not the Nauvoo Library, the Manchester Library, is Andrew Michael Ramsey's Travels of Cyrus. But it's kind of fictitious, and I think Joseph Smith did look at it, and it has a ton of Mormon ideas in it, and that's a more esoteric pro kind of thing. But it's sort of fictionalized, obviously so, and it just doesn't lay out, this really systematic history like Enfield and Mosheim do.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to know how much you think he consulted them and how much their polemic had inspired him, because it is really, really interesting that he would identify with the Christians that they're condemning.
Well, I think he walked into it. He would have walked into it, all right, already having embraced these forms of Christian esotericism.
Yeah,
that you would
right.
In Grimoire's lead D,
Right.
Points him to Plato, and he would have already have had this really clear chip on the shoulder kind of attitude towards the Protestant establishment. That's
right.
Exactly how his father felt, exactly how Jane Lead felt, and so there would have been this total attitude of, these guys just have it absolutely wrong, and that this fuller truth that they keep condemning is where it's at.
Right.
And,
right.
And so he would have been I mean. Anyway, there's all this little technical stuff, but I do really, the encyclopedia entry on Plato,
yeah,
which would have been a really good starting place, cites Enfield. It just cites Enfield, right? So that would have really pointed him to Enfield, with all of Enfield's condemnations, but literally using words that Joseph Smith is going to use in the King Follett Discourse, right? About the condemnation. I mean, what Enfield holds up in that entry is Christian Platonists are heretics because they reject creation ex nihilo, right? That's flat out what Enfield says, and the encyclopedia just flat out quotes him, and Joseph Smith actually uses the exact same wording in the King Follett Discourse. So really take this as, he wants to go and learn Plato, and he runs smack into this Enfield guy. But he wouldn't have had to have invented that, right? He would have already had the attitude of, all the churches are wrong. The Protestants just don't understand the fuller truth. That's almost like the whole MO of what the Restoration was. I don't hope that doesn't seem like it's demeaning, but that's a major part of it.
Right. Yeah, and so what you're saying is, and I completely agree, and I think your framework for it is just right on, that he recognized his own family tradition, what they had embraced with, whatever the esoteric, both esoteric and the Philadelphianism and the pure Christianity. He would have recognized that in the Christianities that Mosheim and Enfield are condemning, and so he would have recognized himself in those Christians.
Right. I mean, Jane Lead's a Christian Platonist. Now he wouldn't have known that probably wouldn't have known that picking up to the family tradition, right? Mm-hmm. But he had all these ideas, and then when he goes back and looks at Plato, he starts to see, pre-existence and deification, which Jane Lead really, really pushes. And so he would have started to kind of piece together, what he would have discovered is, look, there is a historical lineage to what Jane Lead is saying. This just is from nowhere. She is this lost historic truth, this ancient religion, right? Is what Mosheim calls it. Jane Lead is this manifestation through all of her visions of it, that Joe Smith is then going to, through his calling, to implement her visions. It then gives the historical context to it, right? I'm not just implementing Jane Lead. I have this larger historical mandate of restoring the lost truth that is missing from the Bible. That's how it all gets put together, I argue.
I love that. So they provide the historical context for what
Right.
he has encountered with Lead. He
Right.
encounters the pure Christianity from Lead, but then Mosheim and Enfield give him the historical context, which would
Yes.
confirm, which would for him confirm that here are the learned men who for him are confirming what it is, even though they're condemning the thing that he thinks that's lost.
Right. But he was already into this notion of, I
Right.
mean, again, you even give the first vision story. The
Yeah.
churchmen are always condemning the higher truth. They're always
Right.
doing that. Right. And so you would sort of expect it. He was sort of, he
Yeah.
already had that in his DNA from dad.
Yeah.
Don't listen to the Orthodox Protestants because they just don't have
Right.
the full truth.
Right. Which is why I always kind of roll my eyes when I hear various, I don't know, various scholars in Mormon studies call Mormonism a Protestant faith. I just don't see it that way. But anyway,
Depends on how you
that's
define
great.
it.
Great explanation, Steve. Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you, Maxine. Looks like
You-
we're down to the
Yeah,
like-
well, you know, since you've proved that Mormonism is Gnostic, which I've been saying for the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years, because if Gnosticism was Platonism run amok, and if Joseph incorporated Platonism, then the syllogism here is that Mormonism is Gnostic. Just had to, that's a joke. I just had to throw that in.
there's lots of overlaps. As you know, I might frame it a little differently than that.
I
but
know.
There's a
We're
lot of
pre-
definitely a ton of overlap.
We're preaching the same religion from a different approach. Yeah.
I understand. So you guys have Trevor and the Metcalfs have joined our safe space group, it appears. So
They're welcome.
you guys have put
Well,
in
thank you.
my Escamias and Alvarez's have put a little extra time. Anyway, yeah. Did you have anything? Oh, sorry. I thought that was a. Do you have anything else? Anything else, Trevor?
Well, no, I do have questions or comments. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but do you think that, I guess this is a question that's kind of coming from the position of a comment, that so Joseph Smith really buys the position of Platonic Orientalism that holds that Plato's source was actually figures like Moses that came before him, or does he get that specific about it? I'm just curious, because my question would be, other than seeing these resonances between Leeds religion and Platonism, what kind of historical or theological justification can be placed on this? And I think, in sort of scholarly historical terms, the obvious answer would be Platonic Orientalism, but it's not clear to me that Joseph Smith necessarily drew those dots, not that the information wasn't available to him. What do you think?
All right. Well, first, let's define our terms a little bit. My understanding of Platonic Orientalism was that that with with Hellenization, Alexander's conquest, Greeks getting access to all this blending that then happens, and get really, before obviously Plato's very interested in all these, on the Persians and the Egyptians, certainly, but that things blend a whole lot more afterwards, and so we're getting all these all this blending of Platonic thought with Egyptian and other kinds of things. But are you defining it in terms of, kind of like I am with ancient religion, of this notion of seeking what the roots were?
Yeah, the roots, and the argument was started to be made in antiquity, I think, in the Roman Empire, in the period of the Roman Empire, that you could use Plato let's say if you're someone like Philo, it's fine to use Plato, and that's just because, and this is one of Philo's ideas, because Plato was just reliant on Moses anyway. So you don't need to make excuses for using Plato. His since his real source was Moses, it's justified.
Okay. Well, yeah, I see Second Nephi 29 going beyond that, right? I see it going beyond and saying, again, I skipped over a little bit quickly, but the way Enfield describes Justin Martyr, which sounds very similar to Moroni 7.
Yeah.
Went over that a little quick because I was getting a little long, but
yeah, that's okay.
But the attitude that's really laid out what in Mormon speech is, you use the light of Christ to determine all truth, and it says the thing that will condemn you, right? Because again, Mormons will often get kind of these Protestant kinds of notions because it so dominate the culture.
Yeah.
The thing will condemn you is not so much your big worry doesn't so much need to be, oh, you're going to be corrupted by something tainted. It says you do not judge that which comes from God to be of the devil. If you do that, you're in big trouble, it's saying. You do the opposite. So it's saying, and again, when you combine that with 2 Nephi 29, I speak to all nations. I speak to all nations. There's such a, and what's really, really interesting, and again, I'll bring up Ramsey's Travels of Cyrus, because again, there's a ton of Mormon sounding stuff in there. And what Ramsey proposes is what he calls it, again, it's very much prisca theologia, it's very much ancient religion, but he calls it the universal religion.
Yeah. And
what's interesting is how it's defined, because he says, at least in the one I read, it's super popular, so it goes through a ton of editions, and it's in the Manchester Library. But he says, I want to respond to a bunch of complaints when he does a later edition, and he says one of them is that he makes one of the Hebrew sages. At this point, the Jews are in Babylon. So it ends with him going and talking to Daniel. But before he talks to Daniel, he talks to a priest named Eleazar. And Eleazar lays out this very Christian Platonic kind of thought, okay? And what he argues is, well, I just got that all from Kabbalah, and I figure Kabbalah is ancient Judaism and ancient wisdom, so it's fine for me to have this priest talk like a Kabbalist. But one of the complaints that one of the people brings up is he sounds just like Origen.
Yeah.
And what Ramsey says is, well, yeah, because Origen's teaching the universal religion, and so I'm not making him out to be. There's nothing special about this. That is the universal religion, and so yes, all the ancient sages would have taught that. And so he lists out the principles over and over and over again, and it's quite Mormon in a lot of ways, although Joseph Smith would tinker with a few of his points. It isn't. There are some points where Joseph Smith would diverge. But anyway, this is all to say, he presents this notion, and again, Hanegraaff even talks about this idea as well, that there is the notion, and Enfield will describe the ideas of these early Alexandrian Christian Platonists who argue for the same thing, right? Just like Justin Martyr did. The logos inspires all truth. Therefore, we can find it all.
Yeah.
And therefore it doesn't have to go back to Moses if it is a pure revelation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Enfield has the great quote from Clement of Alexandria saying, philosophy was to the Greeks what the law was to the Hebrews, and then I think the line that Enfield even throws in, it both comes from the same source, not being Moses, but being the revelation of God.
Yeah.
The revelation of God to the philosophers. And I really think that those lines in the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi 29 and Mormon 7, are embracing that. And so we do get in the Book of Moses, we do get this expanded revelation from Moses. And so in some ways that kind of sets up something that Enfield talks a lot about too, because when he goes after the Kabbalists, he's like, these idiots and all their ideas of all this Platonic stuff that Moses really taught on the mountain that's just a secret. And he's like, this is such nonsense. And then Joseph Smith produces a text that says exactly.
Yeah.
There's actually this secret text that which is and that kind of thing. And so, but I almost feel like that kind of thing was, I think my hunch was he is more committed to that Ramsey kind of notion of,
Okay.
and Ramsey even refers to, because this is another idea that's around. Ramsey refers to Isaac Newton.
Mm.
And I don't know if you know this, but this is an interesting. Newton actually had a lot of Mormon ideas, and they're kind of seen as sort of an embarrassment. So the biographers don't focus on that. This is all his good physics, not all of his esoteric
alchemy
stuff.
And whatnot.
But because Newton even has the idea of deification and progressing gods, and that God is just an office. It's not a that humans can become this, and
yeah,
kind of controversial about it. But Newton had wrote a lot on kind of this esoteric, you might say. That's not the right word, but his own kind of views of history. And Newton talked about, and I believe it's in Ramsey, that there was a larger, more comprehensive truth that the Bible is only a portion of.
Mm.
And Newton called it the religion of Noah.
That
there's this fuller truth that Noah had that then gets spread around all over the world among all these nations, right? And then Ramsey's picking up on it. He's like, yeah, I'm on board with that, right?
Yeah.
My guy just goes around and picks up all this fuller truth, which again, very Platonic stuff. But so Newton had actually kind of promoted that, and then argued, oh, the Bible is just a portion. And Ramsey really pushes. He's like, no, all these ideas do not come from the Hebrews, because they're a tiny little nation. They're kind of insignificant. What there is there's this larger truth that had come through, either antiquity or revelation or that kind of thing.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So one other little bit. I've always looked at the Book of Mormon as being rather audacious, if assuming that your thesis is correct, and certainly to our contemporary sensibilities now, it's like to sort of cast these things in the mouths of a completely different people that he's got comparatively little knowledge of. But I'm struck by the similarity of this gesture that he's making, which, I mean, to call it a gesture is really the understatement of the century. But with what Plutarch does on Isis and Osiris, and also what we see Iamblichus doing in his work on the mysteries, and that is, and these are two different things, but I think they both potentially bear on what Joseph Smith is doing in the Book of Mormon. So on Isis and Osiris is about these Egyptian deities and their religion and their myths. And it's pretty clear that from an Egyptological perspective, Plutarch's just wrong about so many things. But not only is he wrong, but he's unapologetically and unabashedly wrong. And that's because Plutarch really felt like that this universal truth is definitely out there, but it's really the philosopher who's able to tease it out of the sources. So the philosopher encounters these other cultures. They have this truth, but as a good Platonist, because that's what Plutarch was, that he was the ideal interpreter of the truths that are latent in this culture. And that, in a way, that seems to be quite like what Joseph Smith is doing when he treats ancient American civilizations, is that through revelation or his understanding of this deeper truth, he's able to look at what he sees around him and be almost like the ideal interpreter or mouthpiece for the truths that are kind of out there, but maybe corrupted or partly missing, et cetera, et cetera. The second one would be Iamblichus and On the Mysteries, where Iamblichus actually assumes the persona of an Egyptian priest. And he's writing as though he's an Egyptian priest. He's not an Egyptian priest. He's not from Egypt. And yet he's treating being an Egyptian priest as though it really was little different from being the, Syrian Platonic philosopher that he is. So I think that is interesting to me in light of the Book of Mormon, because in a sense, I mean, as you alluded to here, and a lot of other people have talked about as well, that Joseph Smith doesn't really seem to feel any compunction about sort of identifying himself with the prophetic figures about whom he writes, who were clearly, they belong to different times, places, and cultures, but it's almost as though there's a certain pellucidity or lack of boundaries that exists between Joseph and these figures in his imagination. And I would guess that once again, it's the faculty of revelation or the recognition of divine truth that makes him feel comfortable with identifying with Moses or with Nephi. So just a couple of ideas, once again, drawing on Platonic models.
Can I toss something in really quick?
Go ahead.
He's identifying with their epistemology and hermeneutic. He thinks he's using the same one, which is again, it's a hermeneutic of revelation or vision, or that there's a direct access to knowledge, the way of knowing through nous, or mind. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah.
Right on.
No, that's interesting, and it even brings up, this question of experience, because one of the things that will get tough. Well, if I get pressed on it, because a major aspect of these, early revelations, including the Book of Mormon, but I think a lot of the Book of Mormon with Moses is, it's through the seer stone.
Yeah.
This far out experience that's, it's hard to write about, at least what I get trained in, right? I mean, what in the world is going on there, And I mean, but yeah. I mean, to me, then we end up in this tricky space of, then you got to get in all this brain science, which I'm not an expert on. And then even the thought of, when I would step in as a believer, revelation, why can't, God work through this kind of thing, which I'm perfectly fine with. And that even when people do get into all the brain science, which I think is useful, and I've, and my advisor, Ann Tays, worked on this a little bit, and I use her stuff because I think it's interesting what she has on, hypnosis and that kind of thing, which I think is interesting.
I haven't seen her stuff on that. That sounds good.
But one of the things that's really tricky about Joseph Smith is this is what I really, I wrote all about all the influences and all this kind of stuff, everything I could think of, right, when I get to the translation, right, which is a really tricky topic. And I looked at everything, and at the end of the day, yes, you can make some comparisons, right, with some other kinds of things, but it's totaling everything that he was doing. I'm going to use the word unique.
Yeah. Yeah.
And anytime anything's unique, that's a real problem for us historians. Because what do you compare it to? What do you compare it to? Yes.
Right.
There are some things, yes, people do automatic write, people channel, right? Nobody produces a book like the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Nobody does.
Yeah.
At his age, and again, I argue he's probably better educated than we say, but he's not real well educated. I'm not saying anything like that. Let's not go there. And that kind of thing, and it's just like, and anytime, that's a real problem when we can't make a really thoroughgoing comparison. Because if you can do the full on, and there are little bits and pieces that compare, right, bits, but that full on thing, and started this huge religion, and all this stuff, you go on and on about it, it's quite unique, and that kind of stumps us. at least I find it a little stumping, because if you can't compare, then what do you say?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's actually kind of interesting, I do talk about this, and this I thought was interesting, because, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry I don't have it in front of
That's
me,
okay.
but I'm trying to even remember which publication it was. I believe it was an article that Sam Brown wrote for a collection of essays that came out not long ago. I think Mark Ashurst McGee was one of the editors.
Mm-hmm.
It was works on scripture. And Sam really makes the argument that it would be useful to think about the translation of the Book of Mormon as a vision, and how those Book of Mormon characters often talk about, hey, I see your day, and that he's really kind of channeling Nephi, and he's channeling Mormon, and he's channeling these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, in the sense that, because as we all know, he never looks at the place to translate these, he's looking down, and this is all kind of strange in a lot of ways, and so I mean to even go further, right? I mean, if you take that, and what's also interesting is, again, I can't remember exactly what she says, but Ann Tays actually makes a similar kind of notation as well, of like he's channeling these people, and I might be butchering that. Sorry if Sam or Ann, if I'm getting that kind of wrong, but they say something like that. And I kind of note that they have some similar ideas, and that puts us into this weird kind of, at least for me, a bit of a tricky space on, not having the expertise on that kind of brain science and stuff, and but it's almost like, I mean, one of the things I do make the comparison is that when spiritualism is going to break out just a decade later, right? One of the real tropes in spiritualism is channeling Native Americans.
Oh yeah, no, that's definitely true, and that's fascinating.
And it's in the same neighborhood.
It happens very
the
nearby.
road.
Yep.
And that's going to be a really popular idea, And again, Mormons a little earlier, but they're doing this kind of thing, and again, one of the big things I think I'm at with this, and again, I didn't even bring up the Jane Lead stuff, but Jane Lead's got this whole narrative of leaving the old world, sailing to the promised land, with spiritual natives, and then a story that's very, very similar, visions that are very, very similar to Christ's visit, that lay out these main elements. And our argument is, you put all this together, and I think this happened. That's what I argue. That's where I'm at right now, because again, I was actually kind of stumped. I was stumped on that Plato story of Mosiah, because I was like, well, if he actually thought that happened, why did he put that story in there?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, because he thought they were Greeks, because that's what the Peru encyclopedia entry says. Yeah, this is what this is sort of this. And again, he would have, I think, a kind of a remnant of that earlier white civilization that Humboldt talks about in the same area. There's this older one, and then the Incas kind of have this aftermath of these ideas. That's what it looks to me, and so I even I puzzle over this a lot in the book, and I'm even like, because one of the things that's really interesting is the fact that, again, he is very esoteric, right? I'm not gonna lay out the higher truth, and I thought, well, that has to be calculated. I mean, he's got to be thinking, I'm not going to tell you my higher truth. But then he also thought that's what the Nephites should do. The Nephites should not tell the higher truth, right? This is, the Nephites say we're not telling the higher truth. And he's like, okay, well, this isn't just me, Joseph Smith, being all calculating. This is the instructions that the Nephites were given.
Yeah.
Kind of what.
Well, yeah, and that's why, and again, his process is vision and mysticism and dissociation. His process is accessing the inner doorway to the collective unconscious and to his own subconscious and the collective. And so he is accessing things that other mystics and prophets and seers and apocryphal writers accessed, and Kabbalists, because they're accessing the same sources. And so he's channeling this stuff. And that's one of the proofs that he's not a fraud. He's actually going into altered states of consciousness. There's no other way to explain how he comes up with Moses and with the Book of Mormon. And there's just no way. And the synchronicities, and the intertextualities and the complexities and stuff that he would never have had time to read and figure out and plot as any sort of writer. He's just channeling it because he knows his Bible backwards and forwards.
Yeah,
And he's a sponge at soaking up ideas. And as you said, Stephen, he's completely primed and prepared by the family vision tradition and magic and Syriac and practices to recognize, to value, and to look for the esoteric versus the mundane, known, accepted, handed down versions of everything. He's already primed. He's raised on that. So that's what he's looking for. He's looking for the secret hidden wisdom and inner esoteric knowledge, the deep.
Can I ask a question about and I just throw this out to the group. There was a discussion earlier about the idea of the fullness. And I think, Stephen, you kind of edged into this territory a little bit when you were talking to John, but it doesn't seem like it necessarily is defined in exactly the same way at all times. But like in Nauvoo, I'm more accustomed to thinking about the fullness of the priesthood. And right. that being associated, for example, with the second anointing.
Right.
I just felt, and I'm not trying to criticize John, but he had a very particular view of what the fullness is with texts that he had ready. You had a different idea of what the fullness was as you were putting it out in the talk. But one thing that I'm really deeply curious about here, and this is really a call for speculation, does Joseph Smith himself believe that he has an access to the fullness before he even begins translating the Book of Mormon?
Okay, so that is what I found is that an imprecision in the use of terminology is very common in Joseph Smith, right? He does that a lot. I'm trying to think of some. Priesthood is another one that just kind of means anything and everything and nothing. Almost, I don't know. He throws it around. There's a lot of imprecision in his language, and it's almost like he kind of gets over his skis a little. He's almost, but even the things he says, like he's just like, it's so grand. Well, yeah, he says this all the time, right? It's even in the Book of Mormon. Like, it's hard to put everything I'm thinking into words, Yeah. And so it's up with these words that then end up being kind of amorphous and they move around, and that's something I should kind of be aware of, because I'm wanting to use it in a particular way. And then John's got a point, right? Because it's like, okay, well, he's not defining it that way in all these other ways, and it's a good point.
Yeah.
One way he uses it a lot in even as early as DNC 93 is deification. And it almost becomes a bit of a euphemism. Like he's always kind of wanting to hide that's like kind of a really heterodox thing, but he's and so he'll use these euphemisms. So oftentimes, to take the fullness, and then fullness of the priesthood, that's also another, that's just kind of another, he's always seeking, that's a bit of a topic, but the Melchizedek priesthood is supposed to really, the way Jane Lee defines it, it's and Jane Lee's promises of what kind of power the true church will have.
Mm-hmm.
So he is really hoping, and it even puts this in the scriptures, that when he gets it, no one's locking him in prison, because Alma and Amulek can just blow prisons up. Can just blow prisons up. And so there's always this sense of, wait, I can't get out.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't have it. Right. And then again, look at what some of these other kinds of figures are supposedly able to do in the and so there's always a sense of, well, maybe if we just get the rites right, if we could just get the ordinances right, we're gonna get this thing. So that's another thing. But again, he mixes up the language. Now, on the question of, Does he know in terms of how I define it, does he know that doctrine? My argument is yes, because
I agree.
because of what sources that show up in the Book of Mormon. One that everybody ought to read, which I consider to be the probably was the fundamental centering doctrinal treatise, if you want to call it that, that he used at the time of the Book of Mormon. And the weird thing is that it's also full of Nauvoo doctrine, so it's central to the Book of Abraham also. And that is a revelation that Jane Lead only gives. She doesn't give a name to it. She just gives it a date. But I cite it so much, I know it. April 10, 1677.
Wow.
And it's in her second journal, I believe. And it lays out just a ton of Book of Mormon doctrine and a ton of stuff in the Book of Abraham. But it also has kind of these higher doctrines that they don't hints at, right? So what it does is kind of lay out a plan of salvation. Jane Lead is saying, she often does this with her visions. Like, I was laying in bed and I was thinking about something, and then boom, And her are often kind of amorphous, so you could always interpret these things in different kinds of ways. But her big question was, it was kind of the central Platonic idea, which we Mormons are, always feel like we got the answer to, because Joseph Smith wanted to answer all the mysteries. You don't leave things vague, right? You nail this stuff down. And so her question is, which Plato muses over a whole lot, which is, if we came from heaven, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to come here? Heaven's better. So Plato muses over this a whole lot too. She's like, why would such pure beings, taint themselves with such gross matter, kind of thing. and then she's got this whole thing about pre-existence and why we do it, and why embodiment's important, and why the resurrection's important, and there's a lot of language you see in a lot of Book of Mormon things, Second Nephi 2 and other, that she refers to earth life as probation, and it's not in the Bible, and other kinds of things. Anyway, it's long. It's like a 5-10 page vision, and it has some very, very striking wording in the Book of Abraham also. And anyway, that's one example. But the point is that then I also argue, again, if you read my Book of Mormon chapter, is that I do think he's drawing on the Phaedrus in the Book of Mormon. We have is Alma 13, the pre-existent stuff. He's drawing on the Phaedrus, even the line of Alma de Shiblon, bridle all your passions, you may be filled with love, right? Phaedrus has got the horse metaphor, right? Which basically is saying that you got to bridle your passions so you can be filled. That's straight out. Full throwaway line, but that's Phaedrus right there, and Phaedrus is all about the pre-existence and all about the plan of salvation, right? Now, he definitely has the Platonic dialogues. I know this sounds a little weird, but I chart all this out. He has Platonic dialogues that will show up there or that he uses in other places that he doesn't use it really anywhere else. Like Timaeus pretty much only shows up in the Book of Abraham. We don't really, as far as I can tell, I'm not seeing it other places. But in the Book of Mormon, I think I see the laws, the Republic, and then again, Phaedrus looks like it's his favorite. And it's the one that shows up most consistently through, and again, and then another one that they seems to use kind of sparingly, I think the Phaedo, right? Not to be confused with Phaedrus, is pretty much DNC 76. But is that even that for the Book of Mormon is going to lay out much of these basic principles. So we got deification, we got pre-existence, and that I even think that he really, really lays out. This gets kind of complicated, but I think that Joseph Smith had a sense of deification that we would consider unorthodox, which was deification is a process that you undergo on earth.
Yeah,
it's finalized in the resurrection, right? But that you are kind of becoming almost, I hate to use this, it sounds kind of almost a bit of a demigod if you can acquire super kinds of powers like the Nephite prophets do and like Enoch does and Melchizedek. That is part of the deification process. And so it's actually interesting that you even get some people talking about, are these Book of Mormon prophets gods, right? So you get and it shows up in three places, right? You get when the question of Limhi to Ammon, that first Ammon, saying, is a seer greater than a prophet, and he guy conflates it. He says, the power of God can no man have, but we can have great amount of power.
Mm.
And then there's the question to the second Ammon, right, from Lamoni, art thou the great spirit? No, I'm not the great spirit.
Mm-hmm.
What really gets interesting is when the ultimate example of this, what I call deification process, Nephi son of Helaman, right, really gets laid out, right? He's faithful. He has this promise from God. God gives him like all the power. Well, at one point when he performs that miracle where he tells them of the murder of the chief judge and everything that happens, and it says, and some people said he was a god. Well, in the first two examples, they correct them and say, no, I'm not. But nobody corrects them when that happens.
Wow.
There's no correcting. Now, my argument is that Joseph Smith would have thought of like full godhood happens with the resurrection, but this is like a process of the kind of like a partial godhood, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's even esotericists we kind of hit on this, right? There's that line in I think it's in Exodus where they talk about how Moses is the god to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like Agrippa and other kinds of, the grimoires, they're all over that.
Yeah.
They're like, that's super cool. And so when I really point to the three Nephites, right? I mean, they get this unbelievable amount of power, right?
Yeah.
And then that line where we get like the clear statement of deification, you shall be as me and I am as the Father.
Man.
It does say this happens after you die, but oh my gosh, they're very godlike, right? I mean, it's like they're kind of, in my sense is, he sees this as not like this clear line of, oh, you're just, you're a man with a lot of power, and then this utter transformation after death. It's a continuum, right? You are on your way. You have become. I mean, I believe in his sense, sort of godlike. And again, it's that power that he's always like, Jane Lee promised me I would get this, and we have a lot of power. We got the healings and the visions and that kind of stuff. But what about moving a river or a mountain, and especially busting out of a prison?
Yeah.
That would have been what he really hoped for. Sorry for going on.
No, that's okay. I mean, unfortunately, I think we're probably gonna have to draw this to a close. It's getting close to midnight where I am.
Oh,
Gotcha.
yeah, you're in Florida, right?
Yeah, and I have to get up early. I get my son out of bed to start him off to school at I get up at 5:45.
And Steven's in California, so it's early. It's 8:30, 8:40 there for him.
These guys here, yeah. Of course,
I just had one quick final thought though about everything you've just said, Stephen, which is that again, it's not a literary intellectual process. Joseph, and just tell me if this is what you're saying and what you see. He's absorbing all this stuff, and it's an inner synthesis. He's synthesizing these things within his own mind, and he's spewing them out. And it's not, for the most part, he's not reading things and then transferring it over. He's not doing it in a literary or scholarly way. It's all very much this interior synthesis and storytelling process, right?
I wouldn't say that all, and I don't know where the boundary is. Right? I mean, again, we're left with that, the ultimate statement on translation is a DNCA. You must study it out in your mind. And then if it be right, I'll cause your bosom to burn within you. And if it isn't right, you forget it. Now, just so happens that dichotomy is actually laid out in John Dee. Everything you need to know about being a seer, he learned there. But but it really hits home that, I mean, at least an awareness. He's got this awareness. I have to be consciously formulating my own ideas for them to be verified by God, right? That's kind of stating. So I don't know. I think that probably several things are going on.
Okay.
I think that he clearly has the ability. It would seem. I always wonder about. Let's just say sorry if this sounds cynical, but this is. I very much see Joseph and Oliver are very, very often making the story better. I think that happens a lot. And so that you know, one of the other things that's weird is they don't describe, neither of them describe the translation process, at least not in their own words. We don't have firsthand accounts from them. And they're the only ones who really know what was happening. I mean, again, you know, we have the Emma involved, but she tells it way, way later, and we don't have our actual text in her hands, the earlier version. And then we get all the secondhand stuff. So I don't know.
Okay.
There's all kinds of processes, but I would say that I don't think that that's all that happens. I don't think it's just the synthesis. I think that
Right.
that's
Well, Oliver's clearly copying passages from Isaiah, but yeah. Okay. Yeah.
and again, that scripture says you have to have formulated some sort of proposition,
Yeah. Yeah.
that confirmed or not. It
So yeah,
seems.
it's coming out in this is his version of everything he's absorbed. Yeah, he's doing that. Yeah.
So anyway, it's hard to. I would settle on lots of things going on, even if that sounds like a bit of a
Right.
cop
No,
out.
that makes sense. That makes sense. I was just curious. I was curious as kind of a summary statement, but thanks for hanging with us all this time.
Yeah,
Fred.
thank you. This was great.
Any of the
You
other
froze
participants?
earlier. You became like a science fiction movie earlier. You froze.
Yeah, no, I'm a little bit afraid because the program closed and opened up, and I don't know what that did to the recording.
Well,
Yeah.
it said it stopped and then it said it started again.
Yeah, it stopped the
Okay.
recording and started again.
Well,
Right in the
Right in the
hopefully
middle of my question. So it must have been my weird priestess energy that
that's awesome. I guess I wasn't worthy.
Do Escamias or Alvarez's have anything they'd like to chime in on?
we've overwhelmed them yet again.
I mean, I am very interested, a little out of my depth, so I don't think I have any questions currently, but it's been very interesting. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Thanks for comments, Samantha.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thanks again. I hope to get this uploaded. It may take me a little while. But we can talk about how you want it uploaded, how much of it, whether you want all of this question and answer and commentary uploaded, but we can talk about those details later.
Yes, and you go ahead and cut this part off, but I'm certainly interested in how much if my bishopric feels at all uneasy about
Okay.
who are the people who are here. This is the Escobillas of the Alvarez. So if they feel any compunction about having their names on this weird question and answer, and so you guys could let me know that later.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and I'm not. I'll follow your lead on that, and however you want it. If you just want me to send you the file, I can do that.
Or you can upload it again. I don't know if there's any parts to be edited out or not, but
okay.
Maybe that last question.
All right. Well, thank you again.
I want a whole lot more little safe space groups like this, where we have the esoteric Mormons get together and talk about Mormon Christian Platonism and Freemasonry. So I'm up for that once a week, really.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, I wish.
I was the lone mystic in a subculture of one for too many years. So.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty. I had to search out and find the few people, and find Ben Whittle, and then find Mike Quinn, and then find Lance Owens, and then find you guys. So
yeah, well, it's so wonderful to get together with you guys, and thank you again. It's a real gift. I'm very grateful for it.
Me too. Stephen has written the book that Mike told me I needed to write, and I said, "There's no way. I don't have the energy or time." And Stephen has done it. It's like early Gnostic or Platon, Gnostic Christianity or Christian Platonism Mormonism and the Christian Platonist worldview. There you go.
Okay. All right. Sweet.
Almost. We're getting close. Yeah. Sorry. This was any of that Humboldt stuff was just too big to ignore. So
no, I think you've got something there. I definitely do. I think it all fits. It's all of a piece. It all belongs under that umbrella. And then I do think Platonism is a key part of all of it. And without that, Platonic structure. It's difficult to fit all of that in.
Yeah.
And honestly, you've made an entirely new sense out of the Book of Mormon for me, which I'm really grateful for. It's really awesome.
Yeah. Well, and the Moses parallel, that was the most fun part for me in this presentation tonight, was the Moses parallel.
Yeah.
I love that. You're giving a whole new defense of Nibley,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which I love, because people have criticized him on the wrong basis. He admitted in his Book of Abraham book, I mean, I read it in 1979. He admitted that it wasn't a literal, it wasn't literally Abraham, but that it paralleled all these apocryphal texts as an ascension or a temple text. I mean, and nobody got that. People didn't get that.
Yeah. No, there's a lot. There was, if I could have had him by himself and asked him a lot of candid questions, I think there was a lot more going. You see in that book, One Eternal Round, he seems to be really opening up about some things that he wouldn't have published before. Which I thought was really amazing.
Yeah.
It confirmed some suspicions I had.
Yeah, exactly.
Very little of Nibley, I'll confess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it's necessary that one does, but that was part of my development, was taking classes with Dr. Nibley and reading his works and enjoying them a great deal.
I began reading his installments in the Improvement era when I was in junior high. I didn't miss a single one.
You blow me away. Yeah, that's
The Return of the Book of Enoch, A Strange Thing in the Land.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
But yeah, I mean, basically he was saying the same thing that we're all saying. He was just saying that Joseph Smith was accessing what Joseph produced was sort of the same genre of what these apocryphal texts were producing, and the Book of Abraham fits in with these apocryphal texts, and so in his appendix he's using Gnostic texts and apocryphal texts, and the Book of the Dead, he's explaining what the Book of the Dead is, and he's basically saying, look, they're all getting at this same idea, which is, he doesn't call it Christian Platonism, but he calls it he refers to it as temple texts or ascension texts of ascension, basically deification.
And he sort of promotes that idea. I guess it'd be sort of a Mormon version of ancient religion a little bit, but like Abraham to the Egyptians, and then the Egyptians, and this kind of stuff.
He admits that the Book of Abraham that Joseph produced does not match the papyri. But then he's basically saying, no, this is an inspired apocryphal text that Joseph produced that matches in theme and topic these other apocryphal texts, and that they're all kind of talking about ascension and deification. And everybody went crazy accusing him of parallelomania, and that's not what he was actually. I mean, there is such a thing as parallelomania, but that's actually not what he was doing. So it just completely misses. Anyway, that's another topic.
Of course, the text itself is about, the soul ascending back to the gods, and how you do it. So that, I mean, so his point about that, again, I would say that he's probably, from an academic standpoint, I understand the frustration, right? Because he's using these terms a little too loosely, right? Temple,
he's all over the place.
Just means kind of everything, if you're using that too loosely. But I mean, it is about that, the themes of the endowment, which again, I argue is Eleusis, and the Eleusinian mysteries we're trying to do what the Egyptians were doing. And
that's what he said.
That text was exactly about. And it does, if we were to use, his term, it is sort of a one eternal round thing. These are things that were around, and they were ancient, and Joseph had access to them because the scholarship that was around was good. The encyclopedia was unbelievably fantastic. If people want to, and I would just invite people, be careful saying these lines. Joseph would not have known X if you haven't checked the encyclopedia first.
The encyclopedia references were really interesting. But I mean, Nibley is just saying that they were all accessing the mysteries. They're all writing about the mysteries. mystery rites of
Yep.
ascension. Yeah, and he was really getting at the theme that they all share. He wasn't, yeah, anyway. And
Awesome.
that's what you're saying, but from a very different approach, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. My sense is that, again, if I understand it, I've read very little Dibley, but if I understand it, I what I'm saying. But and again, I think that's even why I would point out, and again, would like to like share this with my safe space group, which is what this is, because I think that there is this sort of question of, maybe they won't put it quite this frankly, but there is sort of question of why you're a believer. I think that is the essence, because my sense is that he is drawing on what I see as very powerful, very authentic, very real antique religion that I find very, very meaningful. But my argument is just simply, he had access to it, I believe, and that's what I'm pointing out. But my sense is, why do we have to view him having access to it as therefore delegitimizing it?
Yeah, no,
Right.
I agree with you on that 100%.
Right.
It doesn't
And my sense
delegitimize it.
is the point that I would put together as well. We can come back to that notion of the unlearned farm boy again. I think his education is a little better than we say, but it's still very autodidactic. Now, I would say that he is a super genius. I do think that, but in a transcendent spiritual kind of way. I think I this group all the time. I'm this huge Joseph Smith fan, and so my sense is, yeah, I can go through and put together the sources that were available, but I will still say, wow,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
look what he did.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly meaningful to me, and that's why make all my confessions to my bishop. This is why I'm here, and this is why I show up, and do my stuff. So,
Well, the parallels, the comparison, the textual comparisons that you're making are really, really interesting, and they're convincing. And I love that you are combining these two views, that yeah, he's a visionary, he's entering into altered state, it's revelatory, but he's also reading and absorbing everything around him like a sponge, and the two processes are working together. And so it's really important to acknowledge both of those processes, because people tend to want to attribute his work to one or the other. He plagiarized it all, or it was all entirely, revelatory.
Yeah.
And he's combining both because he's a sponge. He's a brilliant sponge,
But again, coming back to what his revelations say, right? It's by study and faith. You must study it out in your mind, and then I do think that we've kind of have the notion of, I've even kind of had some decent scholars even kind of think, well, that applies to everybody but Joseph Smith.
Right.
It's got to be, no, he doesn't read anything, and it's like, no, it absolutely does, and
all you have to do is look at the Nauvoo library to be blown away. I was blown away when the church did that display of the books that were in the Nauvoo library. There were apocryphal Christian texts I'd never heard of.
Wow.
Well, he put in his collection, the apocryphal New Testament, that had the Shepherd of Hermas in it. With something that he owned.
The collection of books in the Nauvoo library, they tell you how much he was reading and how much he was aware of. Yeah.
So anyway, that's I don't know. I hope you guys. I don't know if it was just confusion that I rained down on you, speaking to the Escamillas and the Alvarezes.
Okay.
Or if I hope that, again, I was always trying to get to the point of the nature of my belief, and again, why I find this meaningful, and I think, and I'm grateful that we kind of hit on these things. Thanks, Maxine. You've always been a really great mentor to all of us.
Yes.
Oh, you guys are great mentors to me. I don't know what I'd do without you. You guys are the best. But I love that we all have the same testimony.
And also, thank you, Trevor, because it was last year where Maxine and I kind of got chatting, and that's why I had reached out to her for the Safe Space group, and she's been a real asset to all of us, and so it kind of brings things full circle again to have this.
Yeah, you're right. Trevor brought us together.
Yeah, I mean, I met you a few times, but it was pretty casual. I didn't, but the meeting we had last year felt like more of a connection. So
yeah, I was aware of your work and liked it, but I had been meaning to delve into it more, and it was the perfect. I thought, oh, here's the opportunity. He's speaking. So, see, Trevor makes wonderful things happen.
Yes, thank you, Trevor.
Thank you. Well, I've you both have done you've immeasurably enriched me. So I owe you great debt, and I'm grateful that for your willingness, both of you, to come here and share your wisdom and insights and learning with all of us. Thank you.
And
I
maybe
would-
out of
I
kindness,
would-
we should let Trevor get to bed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's,
Well, have a nice night. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Right.
Trevor.
so
Take
much.
care.
Well,
Thanks,
everybody for coming.
Stephen.
I'll be in touch. Thank you guys for coming.
Okay,
Alrighty.
take care.
Bye.
Bye.